Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's the moment they realize you've built something they can't take away. The words hung in the air as I watched George Miller's face transform from smug confidence to shock when James introduced me not as a guest, but as the CEO and majority shareholder of Pacific Northwest Capital, the company that had just acquired Miller Investments. The inheritance that should have been mine now seemed so insignificant compared to what I'd built from nothing. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I first met Brian Miller at an investment seminar in downtown Boston. He was charismatic, ambitious, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was headed in life. I was finishing my MBA, passionate about sustainable finance, but still uncertain about my future path. When Brian approached me after the presentation to discuss my questions about ethical investment strategies, I was flattered by his attention. Most people want to know how to maximize returns, not how to balance profit with purpose, he said, his brown eyes warm with interest. I find that refreshing. Our coffee that afternoon stretched into dinner, and by the time snow began falling, over Boston Common, I felt that peculiar certainty that sometimes arrives without warning. This person would matter in my life. Our courtship was a whirlwind of intellectual conversations about market trends, weekend hiking trips in the Berkshires, and gradual introductions to each other's worlds. Within 8 months, Brian proposed during a sunset sailing trip on Massachusetts Bay. I said yes without hesitation. I want you to meet my father, Brian said as we celebrated with champagne on the deck, the Boston skyline glittering in the distance. His approval means everything to me. George Miller, the patriarch of Miller Investments, was exactly as I'd imagined, austere, calculating, and perpetually unimpressed. The family dinner to announce our engagement remains etched in my memory for all the wrong reasons. While my parents sent their congratulations from their retirement home in Florida, George spent the evening subjecting me to what felt more like a job interview than a family welcome. "So, Jennifer," George said between precise bites of his prime rib, "Brian tells me you're interested in sustainable investment. An admirable sentiment, but hardly where the real money is made." "I believe ethical investment is the future, Mr. Miller," I replied, maintaining eye contact despite my discomfort. Studies show sustainable portfolios are increasingly outperforming traditional models over the long term. Studies can be manipulated to show whatever their authors wish to prove, he dismissed with a wave of his hand. Brian understands traditional values. Miller Investments has thrived for 3 generations by adhering to proven principles, not chasing trendy ideologies. I felt Brian's hand squeeze mine under the table, a silent plea to let the comment pass. "Dad's old school," he whispered later, as we drove home. "Once he gets to know you, he'll see what I see." But George never warmed to me or my ideas. Throughout our 3-year engagement and early marriage, our interactions remained cordial but cool. Brian assured me it didn't matter. He loved me, and eventually we would make our own mark at Miller Investments together. The company was Brian's birthright, and he had worked there since graduating college, slowly climbing the ranks under his father's exacting supervision. The understanding was always clear. One day, Brian would inherit the leadership position and a controlling interest in the firm. As his wife, I would share in that future. I joined Miller Investments after our wedding, taking a junior position in portfolio management. Despite my advanced degree and innovative ideas, George consistently overlooked my contributions during meetings and redirected my clients to more experienced advisors. Brian would soothe my frustrations in private, but rarely challenged his father publicly. "He's from a different generation," became Brian's constant refrain. "Just keep proving yourself. We're playing the long game here." I did prove myself. quietly building a portfolio of clients who appreciated my approach to balancing profit with ethical considerations. My sustainable investment group outperformed the company average for 6 consecutive quarters, yet recognition remained elusive. Instead, I watched as others, primarily men with connections to George, received promotions and accolades for lesser achievements. The situation might have remained tolerable had Kate Walker not arrived at Miller Investments. Hired as a marketing director, Kate was everything I wasn't in George's eyes: conventional in her investment philosophy, deferential to tradition, and effusively complimentary of his business acumen. Where I questioned outdated practices, Kate celebrated the firm's storied legacy. Where I pushed for innovation, Kate emphasized time-tested approaches. I first noticed the change in Brian 3 months after Kate's arrival. He began mentioning her in casual conversation, how brilliantly she had handled the Preston account, how her new marketing strategy was attracting valuable clients. These comments seemed innocent enough until I observed them together at the company's annual retreat. They weren't doing anything explicitly inappropriate, yet there was an unmistakable energy between them. Lingering glances, inside jokes, a physical awareness that made my stomach tighten with unease. "You're being paranoid," Nicole insisted, when I confided my concerns over lunch. My best friend since college, Nicole had always been my reality check. "Brian adores you. He's probably just impressed with her work." I wanted to believe her, but the evidence continued mounting. Late nights at the office became more frequent. Brian's phone would buzz with messages he'd check while angled away from me. Weekend work emergencies mysteriously required his presence, but not mine, despite us working at the same company. The confirmation I wasn't seeking arrived during the firm's quarterly financial review. I'd left early with a migraine, only to realize I'd forgotten the presentation materials I needed to finalize before tomorrow's client meeting. Returning to the office after hours, I found most of the lights dimmed, the space nearly empty. As I approached the conference room to retrieve my portfolio, I heard familiar laughter, Brian's distinctive chuckle followed by Kate's melodic response. I paused outside the door, not intending to eavesdrop, but frozen by some primal instinct. Their voices were low, intimate in a way that professional colleagues' voices never are. "George thinks we should move forward with the Richardson acquisition," Brian was saying. "He specifically mentioned keeping Jennifer out of the loop for now. He's concerned about her perspective." "Your father's right," Kate replied, her tone confidential. "Jennifer's ideas about ethical investment limits are admirable but ultimately naive. Miller Investments needs leadership that understands how the real world operates." A pause, then Brian's voice, hesitant yet resolute. "I've been thinking about what your father said at dinner last week, about making difficult choices for the right reasons. And?" Kate's question hung in the air. "And I think he's right. Some partnerships, professional and personal, run their course." I didn't need to hear more. Quietly retreating, I left the building with my world collapsing around me. The migraine, that had been receding, now pounded with renewed intensity, physical pain mercifully distracting from the emotional devastation. That night, I said nothing when Brian returned home late, his excuse about finalizing the quarterly reports with the team hanging between us like a sad, transparent curtain. Instead, I began to watch and document everything, missing files from my office, clients mysteriously reassigned, meetings rescheduled without my knowledge. A pattern emerged of systematic undermining that could only happen with direction from above. The final confirmation came 6 weeks later, when I overheard George speaking to William Foster, his longtime business partner, in the executive washroom. They assumed they were alone, unaware that one of the stalls was occupied. "Brian's finally seeing clearly about Jennifer," George said, his voice echoing slightly against the marble tiles. "Kate's been a godsend, smart, dedicated to traditional. values, and from a family that understands how business should be done. And Jennifer? William asked. She'll get a fair settlement, nothing more. I've already adjusted the succession planning. Once the divorce is finalized, Brian's shares will be protected from her claims and will accelerate his majority ownership transition. Kate understands the business we're building. Jennifer never did. The calculated coldness in his voice froze something inside me. This wasn't just about my marriage failing. This was about a systematic plan to cut me out of what I'd helped build. The inheritance that Brian and I had worked toward, that I'd sacrificed for, was being redirected without my knowledge. I could have confronted them immediately, created a scene worthy of corporate legend. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Instead, I did something that would have shocked George Miller had he known me better. I began planning methodically, silently. That evening, I accepted a dinner invitation from Nicole that I'd previously declined, needing my closest friends. Perspective before proceeding. They've been manipulating everything, I concluded after sharing what I'd uncovered. My marriage, my career, my future at the firm. It was all expendable the moment someone more aligned with George's vision appeared. Nicole's expression shifted from shock to righteous anger. You need to fight this, Jen. Get a shark of a lawyer and take them for everything they're worth. I twirled my wine glass, watching the burgundy liquid catch the light. That's exactly what they'd expect, I said slowly, an alternative strategy crystallizing. But I've been thinking of something that might be better in the long run. I'm listening. Nicole leaned forward, concerned but intrigued. I've built something valuable. At Miller Investments, a sustainable investment division that's outperforming expectations. Clients who believe in my approach, not George's. What if instead of fighting for a piece of what they don't want to give me, I build something of my own? Start over? Nicole looked skeptical. That's playing right into their hands. Not necessarily, I countered, energy building as I articulated the plan forming in my mind. Sometimes the best way forward isn't to fight over the past, but to create a different future. That night, I returned home to find Brian waiting, uncharacteristically tense. We need to talk, he said, his practiced expression of concern not quite reaching his eyes. For a brief, foolish moment, I hoped he might confess, might give us a chance to address what was happening honestly. Instead, he launched into a carefully prepared speech about growing apart and wanting different things. Not once did he mention Kate, the inheritance, or his father's manipulation. I let him talk, noting how he framed everything as mutual and inevitable rather than what it was. A calculated decision to trade me for someone who better served his ambitions. When he finished, expecting tears or arguments, I simply nodded. I've felt it too, I said, surprising him with my calm. I think you're right. We want different futures. Relief washed over his face, quickly masked by practiced concern. I'm glad you understand. I've already spoken with Stevens about handling the divorce. He'll make sure everything is fair. Stevens, George's personal attorney. Of course. Actually, I'll be retaining my own representation, I replied evenly. I think that's prudent, don't you? A flicker of unease crossed his features before he nodded. That's reasonable. I'll be staying at the lake house while we sort things out. Kate has offered her guest room in the meantime. Kate's guest room. The pretense was crumbling faster than even I had anticipated. I'll be gone by the end of the week, I said, already mentally cataloging what truly mattered to me versus what could be left behind. 3 days later, I submitted my resignation to Miller Investments, effective immediately. The HR director seemed genuinely surprised. They'd expected me to be fired after the divorce proceedings began, not to leave voluntarily. I cleared my office during lunch when few people would be around to witness my departure, taking only my personal items, and leaving behind the trappings of a life that no longer fit. Brian texted when he received notification of my resignation. "This is for the best. Stevens will be in touch about the settlement." What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd already secured meetings with 3 of my largest clients, explaining my departure and my future plans. All 3 had expressed interest in following me wherever I landed. I had also documented every instance of client poaching, information withholding, and strategic undermining that had occurred over the past months. Not for a lawsuit, but for clarity about what I was leaving behind and why. The divorce proceedings were clinical and swift. I accepted a settlement far smaller than what I was entitled to, much to the surprise of my attorney, who couldn't understand why I wouldn't fight for more. Brian and George looked smugly victorious as I signed the final papers, clearly believing I'd broken under pressure and was simply grateful for what little they'd offered. What they failed to realize was that I no longer wanted any part of the Miller legacy. I had something far more valuable: freedom to build something authentic, unencumbered by their limited vision. 2 days after finalizing the divorce, I loaded my car with the essentials and left Boston behind, pointed west toward Seattle and a future entirely of my own making. As the Massachusetts coastline receded in my rearview mirror, I felt not defeat, but a surging determination. Let them have Miller Investments with its outdated values and short-sighted leadership. I had glimpsed something better on the horizon. The inheritance that George had so carefully redirected from me to Kate would eventually prove to be worth far less than what I was about to create. But that revelation was still years away, waiting patiently for the moment when all 3 Millers would understand exactly what they had lost. Seattle welcomed me with 3 days of continuous rain, as if testing my resolve from the moment I arrived. I checked into a modest extended-stay hotel downtown, the kind with a kitchenette and weekly rates that wouldn't deplete my savings too quickly. From the window of my temporary home, I could see the Space Needle piercing the gray sky, a reminder that I was truly in a new place, 3,000 miles from everything familiar. That first week, I allowed myself exactly 2 days to feel the full weight of what had happened: the betrayal, the loss, the uncertainty. I cried in the shower where the sound of water masked my sobs. I scrolled through photos of my former life with detached fascination, as if studying the experiences of someone I used to know. Then, on the morning of the 3rd day, I deleted Brian's number, archived old photos, and opened a new document on my laptop titled Pacific Northwest Capital Business Plan. The name had come to me during the cross-country drive, something that honored my new location while suggesting stability and growth. I had no capital beyond my modest settlement and savings, no office, no employees, and exactly 3 potential clients who had expressed interest in following me. By any rational measure, my situation was precarious at best. Yet as I outlined my vision for an investment firm focused on sustainable, ethical opportunities with competitive returns, I felt more clarity and purpose than I had in years at Miller Investments. There, every innovation had been filtered through George's traditional perspective, every success qualified by skepticism about my methods. Here, I answered only to myself and the clients who would choose my approach. Finding affordable office space became my first challenge. Seattle's real estate market was notoriously expensive, especially in the financial district where credibility demanded a presence. After viewing several discouragingly priced options, I stumbled upon Harbor Street Bakery while seeking temporary refuge from another downpour. The bakery's atmosphere was immediately welcoming. Warm lighting, the scent of fresh bread, and a quiet hum of productivity as people worked on laptops between meetings. Taking a seat by the window with my coffee, I noticed a for lease sign in the window of the vacant office space directly above. The landlord's been trying to fill that. For months, commented the barista, following my gaze as she refilled my cup. Used to be an accounting firm before they moved to a bigger space. Nothing wrong with it, just needs some updating. Do you know who I should contact about viewing it? I asked, already calculating possibilities. An hour later, I was being shown around the space by the building's owner, a retired architect named Howard, who seemed more concerned about finding the right tenant than maximizing profit. The office was indeed dated, with faded carpeting and wood paneling that hadn't been fashionable for decades, but it had excellent natural light, a functional layout, and most importantly, a rent I could afford if I lived frugally. I'd want to make some changes, I said, already envisioning a more modern, welcoming space. Fresh paint, new flooring, updated lighting. Improvements would come out of your pocket, Howard warned. I'm offering it as is at this price. I understand. I'm good with my hands, I replied, surprising myself with the confidence in my voice. In Boston, I'd hired people for every home improvement task. Here, necessity would make me more resourceful. We signed a 1-year lease that afternoon, with a clause allowing me to sublet part of the space if needed, another idea forming as I considered ways to maximize the investment. I spent that night researching local contractors versus DIY options, creating a budget that would transform the space while preserving my limited capital. The following weeks blurred into a rhythm of physical labor and strategic planning. I painted walls in the evenings after spending days setting up business licenses, insurance, and the technological infrastructure needed to operate. I found second-hand, office furniture with good bones, refinishing pieces myself in the early morning hours when sleep eluded me. Each improvement was a physical manifestation of my determination, each ache in my muscles a reminder that I was building something tangible. From nothing. By the third week, the space had transformed enough that I felt comfortable inviting my 3 potential clients for initial meetings. 2 signed contracts immediately, impressed by my vision and the personal attention impossible at larger firms. The third wanted to see how things developed before committing, a reasonable caution that I respected. With 2 clients secured, I could officially call Pacific Northwest Capital a functioning business, albeit a precarious one. The revenue from these accounts would cover basic expenses, but left little margin for growth or unexpected setbacks. I needed more clients, but without the Miller name and resources behind me, traditional networking channels seemed daunting. The solution appeared in an unexpected form one rainy Tuesday afternoon. I had come downstairs to Harbor Street Bakery for my now daily coffee break, nodding to the regular customers I'd begun to recognize. The man at the corner table, always absorbed in his laptop, always drinking black coffee, looked up as I passed and called my name. Jennifer Miller, right? He asked, then immediately grimaced. Sorry, probably not Miller anymore. I tensed, immediately suspicious of someone who knew my married name. Do I know you? James Calloway. He extended his hand. We never formally met, but I attended the Boston Investment Forum last year where you presented on emerging markets in sustainable energy. Your analysis of the Western Cape wine project was brilliant. The presentation had been one of my proudest achievements at Miller Investments, and one that George had dismissed as speculative at best, despite its subsequent success. You have an excellent memory, Mr. Calloway, I said, cautiously taking the seat he offered. Though you're right. It's Jennifer Hayes now. I've reclaimed my family name. New beginnings all around. He nodded toward my office upstairs. I've been watching your renovation progress, starting fresh in Seattle. There was something disarming about his direct approach, free from the political undertones that colored most professional interactions in Boston's financial circle. Over the next hour, James explained that he had recently relocated to Seattle himself, leaving a senior position at a San Francisco investment firm after disagreements about client priorities. They wanted quick returns regardless of impact. I kept arguing that we had a responsibility to consider the longer horizon, he explained, his frustration evident. Eventually, it became clear we had fundamentally different definitions of success. The parallels to my own situation were striking, though I shared only the briefest outline of my departure from Miller Investments. Something told me to maintain some privacy until I knew more about this potential connection. "So, what are you working on now?" I asked, gesturing to his laptop. "Financial modeling for a development project focused on affordable, sustainable housing. The numbers are promising, but I'm struggling to find investors who appreciate the 10-year return timeline despite the solid projections." "May I?" I reached for his laptop. My analyst's curiosity piqued. James hesitated only briefly before turning the screen toward me. The model was sophisticated, accounting for variables most traditional investors would overlook. Community economic benefits, reduced, environmental impact costs, long-term property value increases in revitalized neighborhoods. "Your risk assessment is undervaluing the tax incentives," I pointed out, quickly identifying several adjustments that would strengthen the presentation. "And you're not highlighting the comparative advantage against traditional development ROI, clearly enough here and here." For the next 30 minutes, we refined the model together, the ease of our collaboration surprising us both. When we finished, James sat back with an expression of decided interest. "I've been consulting independently since moving here," he said, studying me with new appreciation. "But I've been considering finding a partner with complementary skills, someone who shares certain values but brings different perspectives to the table." "I'm listening," I replied, ignoring the cautious voice reminding me how recently I'd been burned by professional partnerships. "I should show you what else I'm working on," James suggested. "Maybe you could give me your perspective on a few other projects I've been developing." That initial conversation extended into a dinner meeting the following evening, where James shared his client portfolio and vision for ethical investment that prioritized community development alongside profit. His approach aligned remarkably with the principles I'd outlined in my business plan, but had struggled to fully articulate. "The problem with most ethical investment firms," James explained over locally sourced seafood at a small restaurant overlooking Elliott Bay, "is that they position themselves as charities with returns, not serious investment opportunities. That's why traditional firms like Miller Investments dismiss them so easily." I flinched slightly at the company name, which James immediately noticed. "I've made some assumptions about your departure from Boston," he acknowledged carefully. "But I want to be clear. I'm interested in a potential partnership because of what I've seen in your work and your thinking, not because of any connection to your former firm." The directness was refreshing after months of navigating hidden agendas and unspoken manipulations. Over the next week, we met daily, sharing our respective expertise, challenging each other's assumptions, and gradually building a vision for what our combined strengths could create. James had more established client relationships and greater capital reserves. I brought innovative strategies and a meticulous approach to operations. By the end of the month, we had drafted a formal partnership agreement with the help of independent attorneys. Pacific Northwest Capital would expand, with James bringing his clients and resources into the firm as an equal partner. We would focus on sustainable investment opportunities that met rigorous ethical standards while delivering competitive returns, proving that principled finance could outperform traditional approaches in the long run. The day we signed the partnership papers, James surprised me with a gift, a small potted Douglas fir tree from my office window. "In forestry, they've discovered that trees don't just compete with each other," he explained as I found a place for it in the sunlight. "They actually form networks underground, sharing resources and information. The strongest forests are collaborative ecosystems, not collections of isolated individuals." I studied him, appreciating the metaphor and the thought behind it. "Is that how you see our partnership?" "I think it's how business should work," he replied simply, "and rarely does." With our combined resources, we were able to complete the office renovation properly, creating a space that reflected our vision: open, transparent, and geared toward collaboration rather than hierarchy. We hired a receptionist, then a research analyst, gradually building a team that shared our commitment to redefining successful investment. 6 months after my arrival in Seattle, Pacific Northwest Capital had established itself as a boutique firm specializing in sustainable investments, with competitive returns. Our client list grew steadily, primarily through referrals from satisfied investors impressed by our personalized approach and consistent results. I found myself working longer hours than I ever had at Miller Investments, but the exhaustion felt entirely different. This was building something meaningful, not striving for approval that would never come. James and I developed a comfortable routine, our complementary strengths creating a natural division of responsibilities. He focused on client relationships and identifying new investment opportunities. I developed our analytical frameworks and operational systems. We challenged each other regularly, but always with respect for the ultimate shared goal. I was careful to maintain professional boundaries, mindful of how quickly my last partnership had unraveled when personal feelings became involved. If James noticed my occasional guardedness, he never mentioned it, instead demonstrating his reliability through consistent actions rather than declarations. 1 year to the day after I'd left Boston, I finally felt secure enough to look for permanent housing in Seattle. The extended stay hotel had long since been replaced by a month-to-month apartment rental, but neither felt like a true home. With the business stable and growing, I could justify putting down more permanent roots. James offered to help with the search, having recently purchased a house in the Lakeside Terrace neighborhood himself. "There's actually a Craftsman 2 streets over from me that just hit the market," he mentioned casually one morning. "Needs some work, but it has good bones. Reminds me of your approach to this office." The house was nothing like the sleek downtown Boston condominium I'd shared with Brian. It was older, with character and imperfections, surrounded by towering cedar trees, and featuring a small backyard garden that had clearly once been loved, but now needed attention. The moment I walked through the front door, something settled in my chest, a recognition that this space could become truly mine in a way no previous home had been. I made an offer that afternoon, and when it was accepted, experienced my first moment of genuine panic since arriving in Seattle. Purchasing a house meant committing to this new life completely, admitting there was no temporary measure about my situation, no easy return to what had been. "Second thoughts?" James asked gently when I shared the news, something in my expression clearly communicating my inner turmoil. "Not exactly," I tried to explain the complex emotions. "More like realizing how far I've come from where I thought my life was headed. A year ago, I was planning my future as part of Miller Investments, married to Brian, eventually taking our place in Boston society as his father aged. Now I'm buying a fixer-upper in Seattle and building a company that stands for everything they rejected." "Sounds like an upgrade to me," James said, with the straightforward honesty I'd come to value. I laughed, tension breaking. "When you put it that way, absolutely." The house became my evening and weekend project, much as the office had been initially. I learned to refinish hardwood floors, replace outdated fixtures, and paint walls in colors I'd never have considered in my former life. Each improvement reflected choices made solely for my own satisfaction, not to meet anyone else's expectations or standards. James often stopped by with coffee and tools, offering help with the more challenging projects or simply keeping me company as I worked. Our conversations flowed easily between business strategies and personal philosophies, his presence gradually becoming a comfortable constant in my reconstructed life. "You never talk about Boston anymore," he observed one Saturday as we installed, shelving in what would become my home office. "Not the city, not your ex, not the company." I considered the comment while measuring the next bracket placement. "I guess I've stopped defining myself in relation to what happened there. It feels historical now, not active." "That's healthy," he nodded, holding the shelf level while I marked the drill points. Some people never get to that place with their past disappointments. They keep carrying them forward, letting old wounds determine new choices. Is that experience talking? I asked, recognizing something personal in his observation. James was quiet for a moment, focusing on securing the bracket before responding. My marriage ended because my ex-wife couldn't forgive me for prioritizing ethics over advancement at my former firm. She'd signed up for a particular lifestyle that my principles made impossible. I spent too long trying to prove she was wrong. About me. The personal disclosure, rare from my usually private business partner, felt significant. And now? Now I build things I believe in with people who share those beliefs, he said simply, his gaze meeting mine with quiet intensity. And fine, that's enough. The moment stretched between us, filled with unspoken possibilities, before I deliberately turned back to the shelving project. Not yet, I thought. I'm not ready yet. If James sensed my retreat, he respected it without comment, and our work continued in comfortable conversation about less revealing topics. But something had shifted subtly, an acknowledgement of deeper currents beneath our professional partnership. As Pacific Northwest Capital approached its second anniversary, our success had exceeded even our most optimistic projections. Our client base had expanded beyond Seattle to include investors throughout the Pacific Northwest, and our sustainable portfolio consistently outperformed traditional investment options during a period of market volatility. We had moved to larger offices in the same building, maintaining our connection to Harbor Street Bakery while accommodating our growing team of 12 employees. The milestone warranted celebration, and James proposed hosting a reception for clients, partners, and the financial professionals who had supported our growth. The event would showcase our achievements while introducing potential new clients to our approach. We should do something meaningful, not just another cocktail hour with financial small talk, I suggested during our planning meeting. Something that demonstrates our values in action. The result was an innovative format. Our anniversary reception would feature presentations from 3 sustainable businesses we'd helped fund, demonstrating the tangible impact of our investment approach. We would host at Emerald Bay Resort, a recently renovated property that had implemented cutting-edge sustainability practices while preserving natural waterfront habitats. As the event approached, I found myself reflecting on how completely my professional identity had transformed. The analyst who had struggled for recognition at Miller Investments had become a respected investment leader, known for pioneering approaches that other firms were beginning to emulate. Articles in financial publications highlighted our success, as evidence that ethical investment could deliver superior returns. Speaking invitations arrived regularly, opportunities to share our methodology with wider audiences. What I didn't anticipate was how dramatically my past and present were about to collide, setting the stage for a reckoning I hadn't sought, but perhaps had always been inevitable. The invitation arrived on embossed cardstock during an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning. I nearly discarded it with the junk mail before recognizing the Miller Investments logo embossed in the corner. My fingers hesitated, hovering over the recycling bin before curiosity overcame caution. Slicing open the envelope revealed an invitation to Miller Investments' 40th anniversary gala in Boston, 6 weeks from now. The celebration would honor George Miller's 4 decades of visionary leadership, while formally announcing Brian's appointment as the new CEO. My first instinct was to toss it immediately. Why would they invite me? It had been nearly 3 years since I'd left Boston behind. Then I noticed the handwritten note at the bottom in George's precise script. Your presence would be appropriate as we celebrate this transition. Professional. Courtesy suggests acknowledging one's former colleagues. Professional courtesy, not personal connection, not acknowledgement of my contributions, but cold, professional courtesy. The familiar sensation of being diminished by George Miller flooded back momentarily, before hardening into something more resolute. James found me still staring at the invitation when he arrived with our morning coffee. a habit that had evolved from our first meeting at Harbor Street Bakery. His expression shifted to concern as he noted my distraction. "Bad news?" he asked, setting my cup beside my keyboard. I handed him the invitation without comment, watching his expression as he read it, then reread the handwritten note. "Charming man, your former father-in-law," he commented dryly. "I assume you'll be declining?" I should have said yes immediately. The logical answer was to discard the invitation and continue building the life and business I'd created 3,000 miles from the Millers and their manipulations. Yet something made me hesitate. "I'm considering going," I admitted, surprised by my own response. James studied me carefully. "May I ask why? From everything you've told me, these aren't people who treated you well." "That's precisely why," I said, the decision crystallizing as I spoke. "I left Boston feeling like I was running away. I've built something meaningful here, something that proves everything George believed about me wrong. Maybe I need to close that chapter properly." "By attending their celebration?" James sounded skeptical. "By standing in front of them as someone who succeeded on her own terms," I clarified. "Not seeking their approval, but no longer needing to avoid them either." James considered this, his natural pragmatism weighing my reasoning. "It's your decision," he said finally. "But if you do go, I'd like to accompany you. As your business partner, of course." The qualification was unnecessary. Despite the gradual deepening of our friendship, we had maintained careful boundaries around our personal relationship. Each of us carried wounds from past betrayals that made caution natural. Yet his offer touched me, recognizing that facing my former family wouldn't be easy, regardless of my current success. As my business partner, I agreed, already envisioning how the Millers would react to seeing me with James, to learning about Pacific Northwest Capital's remarkable growth. That would be appropriate. Over the following weeks, preparing for the Boston trip became a background task beneath our daily operations. James suggested we leverage the journey by scheduling meetings with potential East Coast clients interested in our approach to sustainable investment. I recognized this as both practical business sense and a thoughtful way to ensure the trip's purpose extended beyond confronting my past. We booked meetings in Boston and New York, turning what could have been a difficult personal pilgrimage into a strategic business opportunity. This transformation echoed the larger pattern of my life since leaving Miller Investments, reclaiming painful experiences and reforming them into something constructive. The flight to Boston felt surreal, watching the country pass beneath us as we journeyed back toward a place I'd left with little more than determination and wounded pride. James reviewed client portfolios beside me, occasionally sharing observations that revealed his careful preparation for our upcoming meetings. His focused professionalism steadied me as memories of Boston stirred increasingly to the surface. "Tell me about growing up in Boston," he said during our descent, correctly reading my tension as we approached the city's distinctive coastline. The request surprised me. James rarely asked personal questions, respecting the privacy we both valued. Yet something in his expression conveyed genuine interest rather than mere distraction. "It was privileged," I admitted, watching familiar landmarks emerge through breaks in the clouds. "My parents ensured I had every advantage: good schools, music lessons, summer sailing camps, all the traditional Northeast upbringing elements." "That explains your impeccable table manners," James noted with the gentle teasing that had become comfortable between us. "But not how you became so different from what I imagined that environment expected." I considered his observation, never having articulated this aspect of my history clearly before. My father worked in traditional finance, but he had an unusual perspective. He believed wealth created responsibility, not just privilege. He would review investment opportunities at the dinner table, asking me and my brother to consider not just potential returns, but what the companies actually contributed to society. The memory warmed me unexpectedly. Dad called it the sleep test. Could you sleep soundly knowing how your money was being used? It wasn't popular with his colleagues in the 90s, but he was stubborn about his principles. I wish I could have met him, James said quietly. He would have liked you, I replied without hesitation. He valued authenticity above almost everything else. The conversation lingered as we navigated the familiar rhythm of deplaning, collecting luggage, and securing our rental car. Boston greeted us with perfect autumn weather, crisp air, brilliant foliage, and sunlight that gilded the historic architecture with nostalgic warmth. Despite everything, the city's beauty still touched something in me. We had reserved rooms at a boutique hotel downtown, strategically distant from the Commonwealth Avenue neighborhood where the Millers lived, and where Brian and I had shared our marital home. After freshening up, we met in the lobby to review our schedule for the following day. 3 client meetings before the evening gala at the Boston Harbor Hotel. We should eat, James suggested, noting it was well past our usual dinner time. Any recommendations that won't have too many ghosts? I appreciated his awareness of how loaded this city was with my history. There's a small Italian place in the North End that I doubt the Millers ever visited. Too authentic, not enough social cachet. The restaurant proved perfect, busy enough to create comforting anonymity but intimate enough for conversation. Over handmade pasta and a bottle of Barolo, we finalized our presentation strategy for tomorrow's meetings, deliberately focusing on business until the edge of my tension had softened. Are you ready for tomorrow evening? James finally asked, as we lingered over espresso. Seeing them again after everything that happened? I considered the question seriously. I think I am. Not because it won't affect me, but because who I am now is so different from who I was then. When I left, I was defined by what they had taken from me. Now, I'm defined by what I've built. James nodded, his expression thoughtful. Just remember, whatever happens tomorrow, it doesn't change anything about what we've accomplished. The opinions of people who couldn't recognize your value reflect on them, not you. When did you get so wise? I asked, only half joking. Experience, he replied simply. Failed marriage, professional betrayal, starting over. Sound familiar? The difference is I had 10 more years to process it all before meeting you. The why. Personal revelation, rare from my typically reserved partner, created a moment of deeper connection between us. As we walked back to the hotel through Boston's historic streets, our conversation shifted to sharing more of the experiences that had shaped our approaches to business and relationships, the protective walls between personal and professional, temporarily lowered. Morning arrived with characteristic New England clarity, sunlight streaming through my hotel window as I prepared for our first meeting. James and I had arranged to present to a sustainable energy investment group interested in expanding their portfolio to include Pacific Northwest opportunities. The session went remarkably well, our complementary presentation styles creating a compelling case for our approach. You have an impressive operation, their senior partner commented as we concluded. Frankly, when we heard about your sustainability metrics, we expected something more idealistic and less rigorous. That's the fundamental misconception. We're changing, I replied confidently. Ethics and profitability aren't opposing forces when the analysis is sophisticated enough to capture true long-term value. Our second and third meetings followed similar patterns. Initial skepticism, followed by growing interest as our track record and methodology spoke for themselves. By late afternoon, we had tentative commitments from 2 potential clients and a follow-up meeting scheduled with the third during our next East Coast visit. We make a good team, James observed as we returned to the hotel to prepare for the evening's gala. Your analytical precision balances my big-picture approach perfectly. Was there ever any doubt? I smiled, feeling genuine satisfaction in our professional accomplishments regardless of what the evening might bring. Preparing for the gala required a transformation from business professional to evening elegance. I had purchased a gown specifically for the occasion, not the safe black I would have chosen in my Boston days, but a deep emerald silk that complemented my eyes and projected quiet confidence. As I applied makeup and arranged my hair, I studied my reflection, noting how different I looked from the woman who had fled this city 3 years earlier. It wasn't just physical changes, though my previously long hair was now styled in a sophisticated shoulder-length cut, and regular hiking in the Pacific Northwest had added a healthy glow to my complexion. The fundamental difference was in my expression, my posture, the absence of the anxious desire to please that had characterized my years with the Millers. James knocked precisely at the arranged time, impeccable in a tailored tuxedo that emphasized his athletic build. His eyes widened appreciatively as I opened the door. "You look—" He paused, seeming to reconsider his words. "Ready to make quite an impression." "That's diplomatic," I laughed, grateful for his careful maintenance of our boundaries despite the undeniable current that sometimes flowed between us. "Professional admiration only," he assured me with a smile that suggested otherwise. "Shall we?" The Boston Harbor Hotel ballroom had been transformed for the anniversary celebration, the elegant space reflecting George Miller's preference for traditional opulence. Crystal chandeliers illuminated floral arrangements in Miller Investments, signature blue and gold, while a string quartet played classical selections for arriving guests. We paused at the entrance, my hand instinctively tightening on James's arm, as I surveyed the room filled with familiar faces from my previous life. Many were acquaintances from Boston's financial community, people who would have heard rumors about my departure but little of my subsequent success. "Ready?" James asked quietly, covering my hand with his own in a gesture of support. I nodded, straightening my shoulders as we entered. The immediate ripple of recognition was subtle but unmistakable, conversations pausing momentarily, glances directed our way, whispers behind cocktail glasses. I had anticipated this reaction, yet the reality still triggered a flutter of anxiety that I deliberately pushed aside. We collected champagne from a passing server and began circulating, greeting several people I had maintained cordial relationships with during my Boston years. Their surprise at seeing me quickly gave way to curiosity about Pacific Northwest Capital, especially when James smoothly introduced himself as my business partner. "Sustainable investment?" repeated Thomas Harrington, a senior manager at Boston Federal Trust who had always been respectful of my work at Miller. "That's becoming quite the conversation in traditional circles lately. Your timing might be perfect." "Less about timing than conviction," James replied. Jennifer recognized the potential while others were still dismissing it as idealistic. Our growth confirms her vision. The subtle emphasis on my leadership role wasn't lost on Thomas, whose eyebrows raised slightly. "Impressive. I'd be interested in hearing more about your success metrics sometime." "We're in town until Wednesday," I offered, exchanging business cards. "Perhaps breakfast Tuesday?" The interaction set a pattern for our initial conversations. Surprise at my presence transforming into professional interest as our firm's accomplishments became apparent. Each exchange strengthened my confidence, reinforcing that I belonged in this environment not as Brian Miller's wife or George Miller's disappointment, but as a financial professional in my own right. I was deep in conversation with a former colleague when I felt James stiffen beside me, his attention drawn to the ballroom entrance. Following his gaze, I saw them, George and Brian Miller, accompanied by Kate, now clearly pregnant in an elegant maternity gown. The heir apparent had secured the Miller legacy in every possible way. "Are you okay?" James murmured as I unconsciously held my breath. "Perfectly," I assured him, surprised to discover it was largely true. The sight of them triggered complex emotions, but not the devastation I might once have feared. "Let's get another drink before the inevitable encounter." We had just received fresh champagne when George spotted us, his expression shifting from practiced social affability to momentary shock before settling into calculated neutrality. He murmured something to Brian, whose head turned in our direction with similar surprise. After a brief conference, The three Millers began making their way toward us through the crowded room. "Jennifer?" George greeted me with the precise formality I remembered well. "How unexpected to see you here. I wasn't certain you would accept our invitation." "I wouldn't miss celebrating Miller Investments' achievements," I replied evenly, "many of which I contributed to during my time with the firm." If the pointed reminder of my professional contributions irritated him, George revealed nothing beyond a tightening at the corners of his mouth. His attention shifted deliberately to James. "I don't believe we've been introduced," he prompted with the authority of a man accustomed to knowing everyone of consequence in the room. "James Calloway." James extended his hand with relaxed confidence that matched George's authority without mimicking it. "Co-founder of Pacific Northwest Capital. Jennifer and I built the firm together after she left Boston." The careful wording was deliberate, establishing our equal partnership while referencing my departure rather than my divorce. Brian shifted uncomfortably beside his father, while Kate watched the exchange with undisguised curiosity. "Pacific Northwest Capital," George repeated, clearly searching his mental database for information. "I don't believe I'm familiar with your operation." "That's not surprising," I interjected smoothly. "We focus exclusively on sustainable investment opportunities with specific ethical parameters, not traditionally Miller Investments' area of interest." "Sustainable investment," Brian echoed with the faintly dismissive tone I remembered well. "That's certainly trendy these days." "Trendy suggests ephemeral," James countered pleasantly. "Our consistent outperformance of traditional portfolios during market volatility suggests something more fundamental. But I understand the skepticism. Innovation often appears as trend to established institutions until it becomes the new standard." The subtle challenge wasn't lost on George, whose expression hardened slightly. Miller Investments has survived by recognizing the difference between genuine innovation and passing fads. 40 years of success validates our approach, I believe. "Congratulations on your anniversary," I acknowledged sincerely. "Building a lasting institution is a significant achievement. We're approaching our third year at Pacific Northwest Capital, with similar aspirations for longevity, though with a somewhat different vision." Kate, who had remained silent during this exchange, suddenly extended her hand toward me. "I don't think we've been properly introduced since everything happened. I'm Kate Miller." The directness caught me off guard. During my Boston years, Kate had been a peripheral figure, then suddenly central to my life's dissolution. Meeting her now, heavy with the child that would cement her position in the Miller dynasty, I was struck by how young she seemed, how eager for acknowledgement. "Jennifer Hayes," I replied, deliberately using my reclaimed name as I briefly shook her hand. "Congratulations on your family's expansion." "Thank you," she smiled, placing a protective hand over her rounded abdomen. "We're expecting a boy, the first male heir in the next generation of Millers." The comment might have been innocent, merely sharing happy news, but the emphasis on male heir suggested she understood the Miller family's traditional values all too well. I remembered George's dismissal of my professional contributions, his clear preference for a daughter-in-law who would support the Miller legacy through traditional means rather than equal partnership. "How fortunate," I responded neutrally, then turned to include James in the conversation. "We should circulate before dinner. We have several potential East Coast clients attending tonight." "Of course," James agreed smoothly. "Mr. Miller, congratulations again on your anniversary. Brian, best wishes on your new position. Mrs. Miller, a healthy delivery to you." As we moved away, I felt George's calculating gaze following us, reassessing whatever he had believed about my post-Boston life against the evidence before him. The encounter had been brief, but clarifying. They had continued exactly as planned after my departure, yet somehow the reality seemed smaller than the shadow they had cast over my imagination. Throughout dinner, I was aware of the Millers at their prominent table near the stage, occasionally glancing in our direction during conversations with their table mates. James and I were seated with an interesting mix of Boston financial professionals, including several who expressed genuine interest in our approach to ethical investment. "The landscape is shifting," observed Eleanor Winters, managing director of a prominent wealth management firm. "Clients increasingly want to know their money supports their values, not just their lifestyle. Your model seems ahead of that curve." Jennifer recognized that shift before most, James noted, his habitual acknowledgement of my contributions warming me despite the professional context. "Our firm's foundation is built on her insight that ethics and returns aren't competing priorities." As coffee was served, George Miller approached the podium to deliver his anniversary address. His commanding presence silenced the room immediately, hundreds of Boston's financial elite attentive to the patriarch's words. He spoke eloquently about Miller Investments' evolution through challenging markets and changing regulations, emphasizing the firm's commitment to timeless principles in a changing world. "Our continued success rests on understanding that while methods may evolve, fundamental values remain constant," George declared, his authoritative voice carrying easily through the ballroom. "Tonight, we celebrate not just our past achievements, but our future direction under the leadership of the next generation." He gestured toward Brian, who stood to acknowledge the applause with practiced humility. "My son has demonstrated his commitment to upholding the Miller legacy while guiding our firm through the challenges of contemporary markets. Tonight, I am pleased to formally announce his appointment as Chief Executive Officer of Miller Investments, effective immediately." The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause, especially from the tables occupied by Miller employees and longtime clients. I joined the applause politely, observing Brian's moment of triumph with detached interest. Once, I had expected to stand beside him during such moments. Now I watched as a spectator, aware that my own path had diverged toward something more authentic to my values. "And now," George continued once the applause subsided, "I would like to announce a significant new direction for Miller Investments, one that ensures our continued leadership in the changing financial landscape." He paused dramatically, his gaze sweeping the room before settling briefly in my direction. "Miller Investments is establishing a new division focused on sustainable and ethical investment opportunities, responding to emerging market demands while maintaining our rigorous standards for performance." The announcement created a stir throughout the ballroom. James and I exchanged glances of surprise mingled with skepticism. George Miller had consistently dismissed sustainable investment as idealistic and unproven during my years at the firm, rejecting my proposals to explore opportunities in that sector. "To lead this initiative," George continued, "we have acquired Westridge Sustainability Partners, whose experienced team will integrate with our existing structure to create a comprehensive ethical investment division under Miller Investments' umbrella." Understanding dawned slowly, then crystallized with perfect clarity. Westridge was a struggling ethical investment firm that had approached Pacific Northwest Capital about potential collaboration 6 months earlier. We had declined, finding their methodology insufficiently rigorous and their criteria for ethical investment concerningly flexible. Apparently, they had found a more receptive audience in the Millers, who could absorb their client list while claiming immediate entry into the sustainable investment sector. "Interesting pivot," James murmured, his expression carefully neutral as applause greeted George's announcement, especially given their previous position on the viability of sustainable investment. "George never rejects potential profit," I replied quietly. "He just needs to control the narrative around it. Acquiring Westridge lets him claim the space without acknowledging he was wrong." The remainder of George's speech focused on positioning the acquisition as visionary leadership rather than reactive market following. To anyone unfamiliar with Miller Investments' previous dismissal of sustainable investment, the narrative would seem compelling, a traditional firm evolving thoughtfully with changing times. As the formal program concluded and guests began circulating again for cocktails and networking, Brian approached our table alone, his expression suggesting he had been dispatched on a specific mission. "Jennifer," he greeted me with careful cordiality. "I was hoping we might speak privately for a moment." I glanced at James, who raised an eyebrow slightly in question. "I'll be fine," I assured him. "Why don't you continue your conversation with Eleanor about that Seattle manufacturing opportunity?" Brian led me to a relatively quiet corner of the ballroom, his familiar mannerisms both strange and nostalgic after our years apart. The confident set of his shoulders, the way he automatically adjusted his cufflinks when preparing to discuss something important. These details triggered memories without the emotional attachment they once carried. "You've done well for yourself," he began, gesturing vaguely toward James and the reception at large. "Pacific Northwest Capital seems to be gaining attention." "We've built something meaningful," I acknowledged, curious about his purpose in seeking this conversation. "That's actually what I wanted to discuss," Brian continued, his tone shifting to what I recognized as his business proposition voice. "Our acquisition of Westridge gives us infrastructure in the sustainable space, but we could benefit from additional expertise as we develop the division. Your experience could be valuable to us." The proposal was so unexpected that I momentarily struggled to process its implications. "Are you offering me a job, Brian?" "More of a consulting arrangement," he clarified quickly. "Your insights on the sector, client expectations, methodological approaches, compensated appropriately, of course. You wouldn't need to relocate, quarterly. Visits to Boston would suffice." The audacity was breathtaking. After orchestrating my removal from the company, after taking the inheritance that should have included partial ownership, Brian was now proposing to extract my expertise while maintaining the power dynamic that had caused me to leave in the first place. "That's a generous offer," I replied, keeping my tone neutral while organizing my thoughts. "But I'm fully committed to Pacific Northwest Capital. Our approach to sustainable investment is fundamentally different from what Miller Investments appears to be developing." Brian's expression tightened slightly, the look I remembered from whenever I challenged his assumptions. "I'm not sure I understand the objection. This would be a lucrative arrangement that acknowledges your expertise without requiring you to abandon your current position." "The objection isn't financial," I explained carefully. "It's philosophical. Miller Investments is approaching sustainable investment as a market sector to capture, not a fundamental shift in investment philosophy. That's evidenced by your choice to acquire Westridge, whose criteria for ethical investment are notoriously flexible." "Business decisions require practicality," Brian countered, familiar condescension creeping into his tone. "Pure idealism doesn't build successful firms." "Exactly my point," I smiled without warmth. "We have fundamentally different definitions of success. Mine includes integrity as a non-negotiable component." The implicit criticism landed visibly, color rising in Brian's face. "That's unnecessarily personal. This was a professional proposition." "Nothing between us has ever been purely professional, Brian," I reminded him gently. "Not our marriage, not my departure from Miller Investments, and certainly not this offer, which comes suspiciously soon after seeing James and me together, hearing about our firm's success, and realizing you might have miscalculated." His expression confirmed my assessment. The offer hadn't come from strategic business planning, but from witnessing my unexpected success and seeking to reclaim some control over the narrative. "I thought enough time had passed that we could interact as colleagues," he said stiffly. Obviously, I was mistaken. "On the contrary," I corrected him, "I'm perfectly comfortable interacting as colleagues. That means acknowledging our history, honestly, rather than pretending professional detachment. It also means recognizing that our professional paths have diverged for good reasons." Before Brian could respond, James appeared at my side, his timing either fortunate or deliberately orchestrated. "Sorry to interrupt, but Eleanor is quite interested in continuing our discussion about the Seattle manufacturing initiative. She's asked if we might join her for a nightcap to explore potential collaboration." "Of course," I agreed, grateful for the graceful exit. "Brian, thank you for the conversation. Please extend my congratulations to your father on tonight's celebration." As we moved away, James leaned closer to ask quietly, "Everything all right?" "Perfectly," I assured him. "Just an unexpected job offer I had no difficulty declining." His eyebrows raised in surprise. Bold move on their part. "Not bold," I corrected, with sudden clarity. "Desperate. They've realized they're behind the curve on sustainable investment and trying to shortcut their way into the sector. The fact that they approached me suggests they're struggling to integrate Westridge effectively. The flight back to Seattle felt like crossing a boundary between worlds. As the plane rose above Boston Harbor, I watched the city shrink beneath us, the gleaming financial district, the historic neighborhoods, the coastline that had once represented home. Now it all seemed like a diorama of a life I had once inhabited, familiar yet distant. "Penny for your thoughts?" James asked, closing his laptop where he'd been reviewing notes from our East Coast meetings. "Just reflecting on perspective," I replied, turning from the window. "How differently I see Boston now compared to when I lived there. How differently I see myself." James nodded, understanding without requiring elaboration. It was one of the qualities I most valued in our partnership, this ability to communicate, in shorthand, to recognize the weight behind simple statements. "The Miller situation is interesting," he observed after a moment. "Their acquisition of Westridge suggests they recognize the market shift towards sustainable investment. But Brian's offer indicates they don't actually understand the space. They're approaching it as a trend to capitalize on rather than a fundamental shift in investment philosophy," I agreed. "Which is why acquiring Westridge made sense to them. It gives them immediate market presence without requiring genuine transformation. Their loss, our gain," James concluded pragmatically. Speaking of gain, Eleanor Winters seemed quite serious about potential collaboration. Her client base would significantly expand our East Coast presence. The conversation shifted to business planning, the familiar territory of strategy and execution, providing comfortable distance from the more personal aspects of our Boston visit. By the time we landed in Seattle, we had outlined a framework for leveraging our new connections into expanded market reach. Pacific Northwest Capital welcomed us back with the comfortable familiarity of a true home. Our team had capably managed operations during our absence, and the office hummed with productive energy as we returned. Rachel, my executive assistant, had arranged my schedule to allow catch-up time before diving back into client meetings. "Everything went smoothly here," she reported, handing me a neatly organized folder of matters requiring attention. "Though Anderson Renewables is getting pressure from traditional investors about their growth timeline, they could use some reassurance about our commitment to their 5-year development plan. Schedule a lunch with their CEO next week," I requested. The Boston meetings gave me some useful comparative data that should address their concerns. The rhythm of work quickly reabsorbed us both, the Miller Investments Gala receding into background context rather than foreground preoccupation. James and I maintained our established routine, early strategy meetings over coffee, collaborative problem-solving throughout the day, occasional after-work discussions of longer-term vision. Our professional synchronicity had only strengthened. Following the Boston trip, each of us more attuned to the other's approaches after navigating that complex territory together. 2 weeks after our return, James suggested dinner at a new restaurant overlooking Elliott Bay. "To properly debrief the East Coast trip," he explained. "We've been so caught up in follow-up implementation that we haven't discussed the broader implications." The restaurant offered spectacular sunset views, the spring evening painting the water in gold and crimson as ferries crossed against the backdrop of distant mountains. As we settled at our window table, I realized this was the first time we had dined together without explicit business purpose since returning from Boston. "This feels suspiciously like a celebration," I observed as James ordered a bottle of Willamette Valley Pinot Noir. My preferred wine, I noted, not his usual preference. "Perhaps it should be," he replied, his expression thoughtful. The Boston trip confirmed something important. That East Coast financial institutions are finally taking sustainable investment seriously, I suggested. That you've genuinely moved beyond what happened there, James clarified. Watching you navigate that environment, facing the Millers, declining Brian's offer without hesitation. It demonstrated a completion most people never achieve after betrayal. The observation caught me off guard, both in its perception and its personal nature. James typically maintained careful professional boundaries despite our growing friendship. It felt like closing a circle, I acknowledged after a moment, seeing them from my current perspective rather than still carrying their perspective of me. Exactly. James nodded, accepting our wine from the server and waiting until glasses were poured before continuing. Which raises an important question about future direction, both for Pacific Northwest Capital and... He hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. And, I prompted. And for us, he completed, meeting my gaze directly. Jennifer, we've built something remarkable together professionally. I think we've both been cautious about acknowledging that our connection extends beyond business partnership. For good reasons, given our respective histories. My heart quickened, recognizing the conversation's shift into territory we had carefully circumnavigated for 2 years. We have been cautious, I agreed carefully. The firm's success depended on a stable foundation. The firm is now established beyond any reasonable doubt, James pointed out. Which means we're running out of rational explanations for maintaining artificial distance in our personal relationship. The directness was quintessentially James, thoughtful but straightforward, respecting complexity without hiding in it. I found myself both anxious and relieved that we were finally addressing what had remained unspoken between us. Are you suggesting we should reconsider our boundaries? I asked, needing explicit clarity despite understanding his meaning. I'm suggesting that our current arrangement feels increasingly like avoidance rather than prudence, he replied. We work together beautifully. We enjoy each other's company. We share fundamental values and complementary approaches to both business and life. At some point, continuing to pretend we're only business partners becomes its own kind of dishonesty. The waves of Elliott Bay caught the last golden light as the sun slipped behind Olympic Mountains. In that moment of transition between day and evening, I felt a similar threshold in our relationship. The familiar illuminated differently, revealing possibilities previously left in shadow. I've been afraid, I admitted, the honesty both frightening and freeing. Not of you specifically, but of trusting my judgment about relationships again. After Brian, after everything with the Millers, I questioned whether I could recognize genuine partnership from manipulation. James nodded, his expression reflecting understanding rather than judgment. That's entirely reasonable. Trust becomes a more significant risk once it's been broken. But you're right, I continued, finding certainty as I spoke. We've passed the point where caution serves a purpose. We've built enough together to know who we are to each other professionally and personally. So where does that leave us? James asked, the question gentle but direct. I considered for a moment, then smiled. It leaves us having dinner together, not as business partners discussing strategy, but as two people who care about each other exploring what might be possible. I can work with that, James replied, his smile reflecting mine. The evening unfolded, differently from our countless previous interactions, conversation wandering beyond business to childhood memories, formative experiences, hopes for futures not limited to quarterly projections and market expansions. We discussed favorite books, travel aspirations, philosophical perspectives on meaning and purpose. The professional shorthand that characterized our working relationship expanded into a broader, deeper language of personal connection. When James walked me to my door afterward, the moment held familiar tension, the pause between what has been and what might be. His kiss was gentle, questioning rather than assuming, leaving space for my response. I found myself answering without hesitation, the connection between us finally acknowledged without qualification or constraint. "This changes things," I observed quietly when we separated. "Only by recognizing what's already true," James replied. "We'll figure out the details as we go." The transition from business partners to something more proved remarkably seamless in the weeks that followed. We maintained our professional dynamic at the office while allowing our personal relationship to develop its own rhythm outside work, hours. Our team noticed the change but seemed largely unsurprised, suggesting our connection had been apparent to others before we acknowledged it ourselves. Nicole, visiting from Portland for the weekend, was more direct in her assessment. "Finally," she declared over brunch at my favorite waterfront cafe. "Watching you two pretend to be just colleagues was getting painful." "Was it that obvious?" I asked, embarrassed to think we'd been transparent while believing ourselves discreet. "To anyone with functioning eyesight," she confirmed with affectionate exasperation. "The way you finish each other's strategic thoughts? The perfect professional dance of complementary strengths? Classic romance novel material with business plans instead of flowery declarations?" I laughed at her characterization, recognizing its accuracy. We were being cautious for good reasons. "Of course you were." Nicole's expression softened. "After what happened with Brian and his father, taking time to trust again isn't just reasonable, it's healthy. But James is nothing like Brian." "No," I agreed, watching a ferry cross the Sound against the backdrop of distant mountains. "He isn't." The distinction became increasingly clear as our relationship deepened. Where Brian had sought my support for his vision, James genuinely valued my perspective, especially when it differed from his own. Where Brian had navigated around conflicts to maintain harmony, James engaged directly with differences, seeking understanding rather than compliance. Most significantly, where Brian had ultimately prioritized his father's approval over our partnership, James demonstrated consistent commitment to our shared values above external validation. Pacific Northwest Capital continued to thrive amid these personal developments. Our East Coast connections generated new client relationships, expanding our geographical reach beyond the regional focus we had initially established. Eleanor Winters proved particularly valuable, referring several substantial Boston-based investors interested in our approach to sustainable portfolio management. "We should consider establishing a small satellite office," James suggested during our quarterly planning session, 6 months after the Boston trip. "The East Coast client base is growing faster than we anticipated, and these relationships benefit from regular face-to-face interaction. Boston would be the logical location," I acknowledged, reviewing the client distribution data, though the irony isn't lost on me. "Too complicated given your history there?" James asked, pragmatic as always about potential challenges. I considered the question carefully before responding. "Actually, no. Boston makes sense from a business perspective, and I'm comfortable with the personal aspects now. The city has advantages beyond our existing client concentration: strong sustainability research at the universities, growing green technology sector, established financial infrastructure. We could structure it initially as a client service office rather than a full branch," James suggested. 2 or 3 people to maintain relationships and identify new opportunities, with major portfolio management still centralized here. The plan took shape over subsequent weeks. A modest but professional space in a downtown building with strong sustainability credentials, staffed by a carefully selected team who embodied our firm's values and approach. We would alternate monthly visits to maintain executive presence without disrupting our Seattle operations. "I should handle the first quarter's visits," James offered as we finalized the implementation timeline. "Give you some distance from the initial setup." "I appreciate the thought," I replied, "but I'd rather approach this directly from the beginning. Boston isn't forbidden territory anymore. It's just another market where our approach to investment makes sense." James studied me for a moment before nodding. Fair enough. We'll alternate visits starting with the launch next month. Our Boston office opened with minimal fanfare but strong initial response. The financial press noted the expansion with interest, particularly given our firm's remarkable growth trajectory from regional boutique to established presence in multiple markets. Several articles specifically highlighted our sustainable investment methodology as a differentiating factor in an increasingly competitive space. One such article, published in the prestigious Financial Leadership Quarterly, caught particular attention. Titled, "The Sustainability Revolution: How Ethical Investment is Reshaping Finance," the feature presented Pacific Northwest Capital as a pioneer in demonstrating that environmental and social responsibility could consistently outperform traditional approaches in both short-term returns and long-term stability. The article included a detailed profile of our firm's founding and philosophy, with substantial quotes from both James and me about our approach to evaluating investment opportunities. A professional photograph showed us standing together in our Seattle headquarters, the Space Needle visible through the window behind us. "Excellent coverage," commented Rachel, placing the magazine on my desk the morning it arrived. "Though you might find page 47 particularly interesting." Curious, I turned to the indicated page and found a sidebar titled Market Movements that tracked significant changes in the financial sector. Among the brief updates on mergers, appointments, and strategic shifts was a small item that immediately caught my attention. Miller Investments, Boston, reports restructuring following disappointing performance of their recently launched sustainability division. Sources indicate that integration challenges with acquired Westridge sustainability partners have necessitated leadership changes and strategic recalibration. CEO Brian Miller declined specific comment on personnel decisions, but emphasized the firm's continued commitment to adapting portfolio strategies to evolving market conditions. The corporate speak translation was clear to anyone familiar with financial press euphemisms. The acquisition wasn't delivering expected results, significant people had been fired, and the strategy was being fundamentally reconsidered. The timing suggested our profile in the same publication wasn't coincidental. The contrast between our sustainable investment success and Miller's struggles provided a narrative too compelling for editors to ignore. "Interesting development?" I commented to Rachel, maintaining professional neutrality despite the complex emotions the small news item triggered. "Thought you'd want to see it," she replied diplomatically. "Also, Mr. Harrington from Boston Federal Trust called this morning. He's interested in expanding their allocation to our renewable energy portfolio after the quarterly results." "Schedule a call for tomorrow," I requested, grateful for the transition to current business matters. When James arrived for our morning strategy session, I handed him the magazine open to the Miller Investments sidebar without comment. He read it quickly, his expression thoughtful as he processed the implications. "Not entirely surprising," he observed, returning the magazine to my desk. Their approach was fundamentally flawed from conception, trying to graft sustainability principles onto traditional methodologies without recognizing that the evaluation criteria themselves need recalibration. Exactly, I agreed. They saw sustainable investment as a sector to capture rather than a different philosophy of value assessment. James studied me for a moment. "How does it feel, seeing them struggle with something you advocated for years? Ago?" The question deserved honest reflection. "Mixed," I admitted after consideration. "There's a certain vindication in having my professional judgment validated, especially after how dismissively George treated my proposals. But I take no pleasure in watching a company struggle, particularly one where many former colleagues still work. That balance speaks well of you," James noted with quiet approval. "Taking satisfaction in being right without needing others to fail." "Their approach would have struggled regardless of our existence," I pointed out. "But the contrast probably accelerated recognition of the fundamental problems and gives us an opportunity," James added, transitioning to strategic thinking. Several Westridge clients were hesitant about the Miller acquisition from the beginning. This restructuring might prompt them to consider alternatives. We should prepare for potential inquiries, I agreed, though without appearing to capitalize directly on Miller's difficulties. Our message remains consistent. Sustainable investment done properly delivers superior results. The following weeks proved James's prediction accurate. Several former Westridge clients approached us about our methodology and results, expressing concerns about Miller Investments' commitment to the sustainable principles that had originally drawn them to Westridge. We responded with transparent information about our approach without disparaging our competitors, allowing our track record to speak for itself. 3 such clients ultimately transferred their portfolios to Pacific Northwest Capital, representing significant expansion of our East Coast presence. The transition required careful management to ensure these new relationships aligned with our values and expectations, not just our growth objectives. They're coming to us because of what Miller isn't providing, I emphasized during our integration planning. We need to demonstrate from the beginning that our commitment to sustainability principles is fundamental, not superficial. As our firm continued expanding, James and I settled into a relationship that balanced our professional partnership with deepening personal connection. We maintained separate residences, my craftsman in Lakeside Terrace and his contemporary home overlooking Puget Sound, while spending increasingly intertwined time together. The arrangement provided both intimacy and independence, reflecting our shared belief that healthy partnerships require both connection and autonomy. On a rare free Saturday almost exactly 3 years after the Boston Gala, James suggested a hike on one of our favorite trails overlooking Lake Washington. The autumn morning dawned clear and cool, perfect for exploring the woodland paths blazing with seasonal color. We reached our favorite viewpoint mid-morning, a rocky outcropping offering spectacular vistas of the lake bordered by forests in full autumn glory. "I never get tired of this perspective," I commented, accepting the water bottle James offered from his backpack. The combination of natural beauty and glimpses of the city in the distance. It perfectly captures what I love about living here. Balance, James nodded. Natural systems coexisting with human development, neither dominating the other. It's what we try to promote through our investment philosophy, too. Are we having a metaphor moment on our day off? I teased gently. James laughed. Apparently, I can't turn off the philosophical connections entirely, though this particular view does make me reflective. About? I prompted, recognizing something specific rather than general appreciation in his tone. About journey and destination, he replied, setting down his backpack and turning to face me fully. 3 years ago, we were just beginning to build Pacific Northwest Capital, focusing entirely on professional development while maintaining careful personal boundaries. We've come a long way since then, I acknowledged, curious about his direction. We have, James agreed. And while I'm immensely proud of what we've built professionally, I find myself increasingly aware that our personal journey matters more to me than our business success. My heart quickened as he reached for my hand, his expression unusually solemn. Jennifer, when we became business partners, we agreed that our professional relationship would always be based on equal contribution and mutual respect. I believe our personal relationship deserves the same foundation. From his pocket, he produced a small wooden box crafted from Pacific Northwest cedar, its surface polished to a warm glow. This isn't about traditional roles or expectations, he continued, opening the box to reveal a simple platinum band set with a single emerald. It's about choosing to build a life together with the same intention and commitment we've brought to building our company. The moment felt perfectly aligned with our relationship. Thoughtful rather than dramatic, meaningful rather than showy, focused on substance rather than appearance. The ring itself reflected this approach, elegant in its simplicity, valuable for its quality rather than size, distinctive rather than conventional. Are you proposing a merger? I asked, emotion making me reach for the business metaphor we both understood so well. I'm proposing partnership in all aspects of life, James replied, his smile warming his serious expression. Equal stakeholders in whatever we create together going forward. The contrast with Brian's proposal years earlier couldn't have been more striking. Where that had been wrapped in traditional expectations and family approval, this was purely about our relationship, our shared values, our mutual choice. Where Brian had ultimately proven willing to sacrifice our partnership for his father's approval, James had consistently demonstrated that he valued our connection above external validation. Yes, I answered simply, the decision feeling like confirmation of what was already true rather than a dramatic transformation. Yes to partnership in all things. As James slipped the ring onto my finger, the emerald catching sunlight in flashes. Of deep green, I felt the completion of a circle begun when I left Boston 3 years earlier. I had departed seeking independence, determined to build a life on my own terms. What I had found was something better, not just autonomy, but authentic. Partnership, not just professional success, but personal fulfillment. We should probably discuss practical considerations, James suggested as we continued our hike, hands linked comfortably. Living arrangements, timeline, celebration format. Always the pragmatist, I laughed, squeezing his hand affectionately. Though you're right, of course. I'm assuming a quiet ceremony rather than a production. Absolutely, he agreed immediately. Something meaningful to us rather than performative for others. Though we should consider how to approach the firm announcement. Our team deserves thoughtful communication about this development. We spent the remainder of the hike discussing these practical aspects, our conversation flowing naturally between personal preferences and professional considerations. By the time we returned to the trailhead, we had outlined a preliminary plan, a small ceremony with close friends in the spring, consolidating our households at my lakeside terrace home while maintaining James's waterfront property for eventual weekend retreats, and a carefully structured communication approach for our professional network. The following Monday morning, we gathered our core team for a brief meeting before the regular strategy session. Their faces registered varying degrees of surprise and delight as we shared our news, followed by warm congratulations that suggested our relationship had indeed been obvious to those working closely with us. This doesn't change our professional structure, I emphasized, addressing the unasked question about how our marriage might affect the firm's operations. Pacific Northwest Capital continues with the same leadership approach and decision-making, processes that have brought us success. Though we may adjust our alternating travel schedule for the Boston office, James added practically. Coordination becomes somewhat simpler with a shared household. The transition proved remarkably smooth, both personally and professionally. Our compatible living styles merged easily into shared space, while our established work rhythms continued with minimal disruption. If anything, removing the artificial separation between our personal and professional connections created greater efficiency in both domains. News of our engagement spread quickly through professional circles, generating congratulatory messages from clients and colleagues alike. Among these was a brief email from Thomas Harrington at Boston Federal Trust. Congratulations on your engagement. Having observed your professional partnership evolve over the past 3 years, I can only imagine how formidable you'll be with all aspects of life aligned. On a related note, you may be interested to know that Miller Investments is closing their sustainability division entirely, redirecting those clients back to traditional portfolios or releasing them to seek other options. Several are asking for introductions to your firm based on your outstanding performance metrics. Timing, as they say, is everything. I forwarded the message to James with a simple note. Interesting development. Thoughts on how to approach these potential new relationships? His response arrived minutes later. With the same integrity and transparency we bring to all client interactions. Their disappointment with Miller creates opportunity, but doesn't change our responsibility to ensure proper alignment with our approach. Perhaps a small reception during our next Boston visit to allow these prospects to understand our philosophy directly? The suggestion exemplified James's consistent approach, recognizing business opportunity while maintaining focus on substantive value rather than merely capitalizing on a competitor's struggles. It reinforced my certainty that our partnership, in all its dimensions, was built on genuine shared principles rather than temporary alignment of interests. As we planned our next Boston visit to coincide with this potential client reception, I found myself reflecting on the circular journey that had brought me back to the city I had once fled. I had left heartbroken and betrayed, my professional contributions dismissed, my personal trust shattered. I would return engaged to a true partner, leading a thriving company built on the very principles George Miller had rejected, positioned to welcome clients disillusioned by his firm's superficial approach to values they genuinely held. The symmetry felt not like vindication, but like integration. The painful experiences that had once defined my departure now merely contributing context to a life that had found its authentic direction. Success had not required revenge or even justice in conventional terms. It had simply required the courage to build something true to my values regardless of those who had once dismissed them. As I added the Boston reception to our calendar, scheduling it for exactly 3 years and 2 months after that pivotal gala where we had first confronted the Millers as equals, I recognized that the true measure of healing isn't the ability to face your past without pain. It's the realization that your past no longer defines your future. Brian, George, and the inheritance that had once seemed so crucial were now merely characters and plot points in a story that had long since found a different narrative arc. The calendar notification pinged softly, confirming the scheduled event. 3 weeks from today, we would host current and prospective clients at the Harborview Hotel, directly across from Miller Investments headquarters, where George would have a clear view of what his rejection of sustainable investment principles had ultimately cost. I hadn't planned this particular detail. It simply happened that the Harborview offered the best combination of location, facilities, and environmental credentials for our purposes. Yet I couldn't help appreciating the poetic justice in the arrangement, not orchestrated from malice, but emerging naturally from the different paths we had chosen. Reception confirmed, I messaged James, who was in a client meeting across town. Harborview Hotel, 3 weeks from Thursday. His response arrived moments later. Perfect timing. Eleanor Winters confirms she'll attend and bring several interested colleagues. This could significantly expand our Boston presence. The opportunity before us extended far beyond merely acquiring clients disappointed with Miller Investments. It represented the potential to fundamentally shift Boston's traditional investment community toward the principles we had championed from the beginning, demonstrating that ethical considerations and financial performance weren't opposing forces, but complementary strengths when properly integrated. As I reviewed the guest list taking shape for our reception, I noted with interest that several long-established Boston financial families had accepted our invitation, representatives of firms that had historically aligned with Miller Investments' traditional approach. Their curiosity suggested a broader shift in the market, an opening to principles that had once been dismissed as idealistic or impractical. A notification from our Boston office manager appeared in my inbox. Mr. Miller, George, has requested a meeting during your upcoming visit. Message states it concerns matters of mutual interest regarding market evolution. How would you like me to respond? I sat back, genuinely surprised by this development. After 3 years of no direct contact, George Miller was initiating communication, and doing so through formal channels rather than personal connection. The phrasing was typically measured, revealing nothing of his actual purpose while suggesting professional rather than personal matters. Interesting, James commented when I forwarded the message. Your call entirely on whether to accept. I considered the request carefully, examining my own reaction for any lingering emotional charge. Finding none beyond mild curiosity, I composed a response. Please schedule Mr. Miller for Thursday morning 10 a.m. at our office. Allocation 30 minutes initially. Note that Mr. Calloway will also be present as my business partner and fiancé. The specification was deliberate, establishing both personal and professional boundaries from the outset. Whatever George wanted to discuss would happen on our territory, within our time constraints, and with full acknowledgement of my current life circumstances. With this unexpected addition to our Boston agenda, I found myself contemplating what George might want after all this time. Market information, client introductions, some form of reconciliation. The possibilities seemed equally plausible and implausible, leaving me curious but not anxious about the upcoming encounter. What remained clear was that regardless of George's purpose, the meeting would occur from a position of established strength rather than vulnerability. This time, I would be greeting him not as Brian's wife seeking approval, or as a junior associate struggling for recognition, but as the co-founder of a thriving firm whose success validated the very approaches he had once dismissed. The symmetry felt complete, a circle not just returning to its starting point but spiraling upward to a new level of perspective. Whatever George Miller might want from this meeting, its true significance lay in the fact that I no longer needed anything from him. Boston greeted us with unseasonably warm April sunshine, the city's famous springtime energy amplified by perfect weather. Cherry blossoms lined Commonwealth Avenue, and sailboats dotted the harbor as we made our way from Logan Airport to our downtown hotel. The familiar landscape now held a different quality, no longer the setting of painful memories, but simply another business destination where our firm operated. Hard to believe it's been 3 years, James observed as our taxi passed the financial district where Miller Investments headquarters dominated one corner. The city feels completely different now. The city hasn't changed, I replied, watching the familiar buildings slide past. We have. Our Boston office welcomed us with the efficient warmth we'd cultivated throughout Pacific Northwest capital. The small team we'd assembled reflected our values, diverse in background but unified, in commitment to our investment philosophy. Under the leadership of Sophia Chen, a brilliant portfolio manager who had relocated from Seattle to establish our East Coast presence, the office had quickly developed its own identity while maintaining seamless integration with our headquarters. Operations. Client response to the reception announcement has exceeded expectations, Sophia reported during our initial briefing. We've had to expand our reservation at the Harbor View to accommodate additional attendees. Several major institutional investors who previously declined meetings have specifically requested introductions. The Miller situation has accelerated. Interest, added Marcus Williams, our East Coast client relationship manager. Their complete withdrawal from sustainability has created significant disruption for clients who genuinely value those principles. How are they managing the transition? James asked, his pragmatic attention to competitor strategy ever present. Poorly, Marcus replied frankly. They're presenting it as a strategic realignment, rather than acknowledging the fundamental failure of their approach. Clients see through the corporate language to the reality. Miller never truly committed to sustainability principles, just tried to capitalize on market interest without substantive methodology. I nodded, unsurprised by this assessment. That matches what we observed from the beginning. Have you had direct contact with any former Westridge clients? 7 have scheduled individual consultations this week, Sophia confirmed. All previously declined our outreach while Miller was still attempting their sustainability division. The complete shutdown has forced them to seek alternatives. And George Miller's meeting request? James inquired, raising the topic that had lingered at the edges of my thoughts since its arrival. Scheduled as directed, Marcus confirmed. Thursday at 10 a.m., 30 minutes allocated. He confirmed without comment about Mr. Calloway's attendance. The conversation shifted to preparation for our client reception, reviewing profiles of key attendees and identifying specific opportunities to highlight our approach. The professional focus provided comfortable distance from the looming meeting. With George, allowing me to approach it as a business matter rather than personal confrontation. Our first day in Boston filled quickly with client meetings, each conversation reinforcing the market shift toward genuine sustainability principles that we had identified years earlier. Institutional investors who had once dismissed ethical considerations as secondary now sought detailed explanations of our methodology for integrating environmental and social governance factors into financial analysis. The language has changed completely, I observed to James as we walked between appointments. 3 years ago, these same firms were asking whether sustainable investment could deliver competitive returns. Now they're asking how quickly they can integrate these principles without appearing opportunistic. Market evolution. James nodded. Though what's interesting is how few firms have developed robust methodologies despite the obvious demand. They recognize the trend, but underestimated the fundamental recalibration required, which creates our current opportunity, I concluded, as we arrived at Boston Federal Trust for our meeting with Thomas Harrington and his investment committee. The session ran longer than scheduled, the committee's questions demonstrating serious interest in substantially increasing their allocation to our sustainable portfolios. By the time we concluded, preliminary agreements had been outlined for managing 3 institutional funds previously held by traditional investment firms. This expansion would effectively double our East Coast assets under management, James noted as we debriefed over dinner that evening, with corresponding increase in operational requirements. Sophia's been anticipating this growth, I reminded him. Her staffing plan accommodates significant expansion without compromising our quality standards or methodological integrity. Always thinking 3 steps ahead, James smiled. One of your many qualities I've learned to rely on. The comment reflected the easy appreciation that characterized our relationship, acknowledging strengths without qualification or competition. As we discussed the operational implications of our potential expansion, I found myself reflecting on how completely our partnership model differed from the Miller approach to both business and personal relationships. Tomorrow's George meeting, James said, shifting topics as we finished dinner. Any specific preparation you want to consider? I considered the question seriously. Not really. Without knowing his purpose, extensive preparation seems unnecessary. Our position is clear and hasn't changed. We believe in sustainable investment as a fundamental philosophy, not a marketing segment. And the personal dimension? James asked gently. Is largely irrelevant, I replied after brief reflection. Whatever happened between the Millers and me created the circumstances that led to Pacific Northwest Capital. But that history doesn't determine our current decisions or future direction. James nodded, satisfaction in his expression. That perspective is exactly why I'm certain this meeting won't be problematic regardless of George's agenda. You've genuinely moved beyond letting them affect your choices. We returned to the hotel and reviewed final details for the client reception before settling into comfortable evening routines. The normalcy felt significant, preparing for a potentially loaded encounter with my former father-in-law without anxiety disrupting regular patterns. Time and distance had transformed what once felt overwhelming into merely another business interaction requiring professional management. Thursday morning dawned bright and clear, Boston's spring energy palpable as we walked the short distance from our hotel to our downtown office. The familiar rhythms of the financial district surrounded us, purposeful professionals navigating between historic buildings and modern towers. The atmosphere of established tradition mingled with contemporary urgency that characterized the city's business culture. Mr. Miller arrived 5 minutes ago. Our receptionist informed us quietly as we entered. I've settled him in the corner conference room as instructed. Thank you, Linda. We'll be ready momentarily, I replied, appreciating her careful attention to the potentially sensitive situation. James and I took a moment in my office to align on approach. Let him state his purpose before responding, James suggested. Given the unusual nature of this request, understanding his actual agenda seems prudent before establishing our position. Agreed, I nodded, though I expect it relates to their sustainable investment failure and our corresponding success with former Westridge clients. Most likely, James concurred. Shall we? We entered the conference room together, presenting unified partnership rather than hierarchical structure. George Miller stood as we entered, his commanding presence familiar, yet somehow diminished from my memory. His perfectly tailored suit and precisely knotted tie remained consistent with the image he had always cultivated, but subtle signs of aging had emerged since our last encounter. Deeper lines around his eyes, slightly less certain posture. Jennifer, he greeted me with formal correctness before turning to James. Mr. Calloway, thank you both for making time during what must be a busy visit. Of course, I replied with professional courtesy, gesturing toward the conference table. Please, let's sit. I understand you wanted to discuss matters of mutual interest. George settled into his chair with practiced dignity, placing a slim leather portfolio on the table before him. The familiar precision of his movements, the careful adjustment of his French cuffs, the deliberate alignment of papers, triggered unexpected memories of countless Miller Investments meetings where similar gestures had preceded business discussions. First, congratulations are in order, he began, his tone measured, both on your engagement and on Pacific Northwest Capital's remarkable growth. The financial community has taken note of your success in the sustainable investment sector. Thank you, James responded smoothly when I nodded acknowledgement. We've been fortunate to identify and develop opportunities that align with evolving market priorities. George's expression tightened almost imperceptibly at the reference to evolving market priorities, a subtle reminder of Miller Investments' failure to successfully navigate those same changes. Indeed, market evolution presents both challenges and opportunities depending on one's positioning and adaptability. The corporate speak set the tone, formal, impersonal, cloaked in business language rather than direct acknowledgement of our shared history. I decided to expedite the conversation rather than lingering in preliminary pleasantries. You requested this meeting, Mr. Miller. What specific matters did you wish to discuss? If the directness surprised him, George revealed nothing beyond a slight incline of his head. As you're undoubtedly aware, Miller Investments has recently concluded its exploration of dedicated sustainable investment services. This decision reflects our assessment that integration of relevant factors into our established methodology serves clients more effectively than separate divisional structure. The corporate euphemisms were almost comically transparent. Concluded its exploration, rather than failed completely and shut down the division. Integration of relevant factors, rather than superficial acknowledgement of sustainability concerns without fundamental methodology changes. Market approaches certainly vary, I replied neutrally, though client response ultimately determines viability. George nodded, accepting the pointed observation without visible reaction. Precisely why I've requested this conversation. Several former Westridge clients have expressed interest in maintained relationships with Miller Investments while accessing specialized sustainable investment services. We're exploring potential partnership arrangements that would allow continuity while acknowledging specialized expertise. The actual purpose began emerging from the careful language. Miller Investments had lost valuable clients to their sustainability failure, but wanted to retain some connection through partnership with successful firms in that sector. Given our established position and proven methodology, Pacific Northwest Capital represented a potential solution to their client retention problem. Interesting proposition, James commented, his tone revealing nothing of his assessment. What specific arrangement are you envisioning? George opened his portfolio, removing a document outlining the concept in formal business terms. A strategic alliance whereby Miller Investments would maintain primary client relationships, while Pacific Northwest Capital would provide specialized sustainable portfolio management as a white label service. Revenue sharing would reflect the value contribution naturally. The proposal was simultaneously audacious and predictable. Miller Investments would keep client relationships and majority revenue while accessing our expertise to solve their sustainability failure. We would provide the actual investment, value while they retained client control and primary compensation. Essentially, you're proposing we provide the sustainability expertise your firm failed to develop internally, while you maintain client ownership and relationship management. I summarized directly, setting aside business euphemisms. That characterization lacks nuance, George replied, his tone cooling slightly. Miller Investments brings substantial value through established client relationships, comprehensive wealth management services, and institutional credibility developed over 4 decades. All valid contributions, James acknowledged diplomatically. Though current market movements suggest clients increasingly value substantive sustainability expertise over institutional legacy when those factors conflict. The observation landed precisely, highlighting the fundamental reality behind George's proposal. Miller Investments' institutional credibility was proving insufficient to retain clients specifically seeking genuine sustainability approaches. Their dismissal of these principles as secondary considerations now threatened primary client relationships, as values-oriented investors recognized the difference between marketing language and methodological commitment. Market priorities shift continuously, George countered smoothly. Experienced institutions navigate these shifts without overcorrecting toward temporary trends. Our proposed arrangement acknowledges current client interests while maintaining appropriate balance between established principles and emerging considerations. The familiar condescension toward sustainability as a temporary trend, rather than fundamental evolution, revealed that despite market evidence, George's perspective remained unchanged. He still viewed ethical investment as a marketing segment, rather than a substantive approach requiring philosophical alignment and methodological renovation. Your perspective is clear, I responded after a measured silence. However, it highlights precisely why such an arrangement would be problematic. Pacific Northwest Capital was founded on the principle that sustainable investment requires fundamental methodology reformation, not superficial integration into traditional approaches. Our success derives from this philosophical commitment, not merely technical expertise that can be separated from underlying values. George's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, the first crack in his practiced corporate demeanor. You believe philosophical alignment is necessary for business partnership? In this specific domain, absolutely, James confirmed without hesitation. Sustainable investment isn't a technical overlay on traditional methods. It's a fundamentally different approach to evaluating value, risk, and return. Attempting to separate the methodology from its philosophical foundation creates precisely the integration failures Miller Investments experienced with Westridge. The assessment was professional rather than personal, focused on business reality rather than historical grievances. Yet its accuracy clearly irritated George, whose carefully maintained facade showed subtle signs of strain, tightened jaw, slightly rigid posture, the almost imperceptible narrowing of his eyes that I recognized from countless Miller Investments meetings when his authority was challenged. An interesting perspective, he replied after a calculated pause, though perhaps influenced by factors beyond pure business assessment. The implication was clear, that my rejection of his proposal stemmed from personal history rather than professional judgment. The suggestion was both predictable and revealing of his continued inability to recognize my decisions as legitimately independent from our past relationship. If you're suggesting personal history is influencing our business assessment, I should clarify something important, I responded calmly. Pacific Northwest Capital has declined similar white-label proposals from 3 other traditional investment firms seeking to address sustainability gaps without fundamental methodology adjustments. Our position reflects consistent business philosophy, not specific reactions to Miller Investments. The information visibly surprised George, who had clearly entered the meeting believing his proposal faced obstacles unique to our particular history rather than consistent with our broader business approach. The realization that his offer wasn't receiving special consideration, either negative or positive, disrupted his prepared narrative. "I appreciate your candor," he recovered smoothly. "Though I believe you're overlooking substantial mutual benefit potential. Perhaps consideration of specific terms might address philosophical concerns while achieving practical advantages for both organizations." "The misalignment is fundamental, not technical," James explained with professional courtesy. "Our sustainable investment approach isn't a product that can be white-labeled without compromising its integrity. It requires consistent application throughout the investment process, from client education through portfolio construction to ongoing management. Success in this domain requires authenticity," I added, meeting George's gaze directly. "Clients increasingly recognize the difference between genuine commitment to sustainable principles and surface-level adaptation to market trends. No partnership structure can bridge that philosophical gap." George studied us with the calculating assessment I remembered well from Miller investment strategy sessions, evaluating positions, identifying leverage, calculating acceptable compromise, to achieve primary objectives. After a moment, his expression shifted subtly toward something I hadn't previously associated with him: resignation. "I see," he acknowledged, beginning to gather his materials with deliberate movements. "While disappointing, your position is clear. I appreciate your direct communication rather than protracted consideration of an arrangement you find fundamentally unworkable." The response surprised me. I had expected continued negotiation, perhaps leveraging our history or suggesting compromise structures. Instead, George seemed to recognize with unexpected clarity that our position wasn't a negotiating stance, but a genuine philosophical boundary. If Miller Investments is serious about addressing client interest in sustainable investment, we'd be happy to suggest alternative approaches that might better align with your organizational structure, James offered, maintaining professional courtesy despite the clear rejection. George paused, his portfolio half closed, expression revealing brief internal calculation before responding. "I would welcome those suggestions, actually. While our positions differ, your expertise in this domain is evidently substantial. Professional courtesy suggests value in considering alternative perspectives." The shift was subtle but significant, from proposing a specific business arrangement to requesting general guidance on sustainable investment integration. Whether strategic repositioning or genuine openness to alternatives, the change acknowledged. Our expertise in territory Miller Investments had failed to successfully navigate. Over the next 15 minutes, James outlined several approaches traditional investment firms had successfully implemented to address sustainability considerations without requiring complete philosophical transformation. The conversation remained professional and substantive, focused on practical business considerations rather than personal history or competitive positioning. As our scheduled time concluded, George gathered his materials with characteristic precision. "This has been unexpectedly informative," he acknowledged. "While our original proposal isn't viable, your alternative suggestions merit consideration. Would you be amenable to further discussion should we explore these approaches?" "Of course," I replied without hesitation. Professional courtesy extends to constructive dialogue regardless of organizational competition or historical context. The deliberate echo of his earlier professional courtesy language wasn't lost on George, whose expression reflected momentary recognition before returning to practice neutrality. Indeed, though perhaps some historical context warrants acknowledgement before we conclude. The statement hung in the air, creating a surprising shift from business discussion toward personal territory we had both carefully avoided. James glanced at me, silently confirming my comfort with this unexpected direction before responding. "We have a few minutes remaining in our scheduled time," he noted neutrally. neither encouraging nor discouraging the potential conversation shift. George straightened almost imperceptibly, the subtle squaring of shoulders I recognized as preparation for difficult communication. Recent market developments have demonstrated the validity of certain investment approaches Jennifer advocated during her time with Miller Investments. The sustainable portfolio strategy she proposed 3 years before her departure would have positioned us advantageously for current market conditions had we implemented it. The acknowledgement, coming closest to an admission of error I had ever witnessed from George Miller, caught me completely off guard. Not merely recognition of my professional judgment, but implicit acknowledgement that rejecting my recommendations had proven costly to Miller Investments. Market validation often requires patience, I responded carefully, unsure of his purpose in raising this history. Emerging approaches frequently face institutional resistance before broader adoption demonstrates their viability. Institutional resistance, George repeated with the faintest suggestion of ironic recognition. A diplomatic characterization of what might more accurately be described as myopic dismissal based on outdated assumptions. My outdated assumptions, specifically. The personal accountability, completely uncharacteristic of the George Miller I had known, created a moment of genuine surprise that I struggled to conceal. James remained silent beside me, recognizing this exchange had shifted beyond business partnership to territory uniquely ours to navigate. Your current success, George continued when I offered no immediate response, while undoubtedly unwelcome to Miller Investments as a competitor, represents market validation of principles worth acknowledging regardless of our organizational relationship. Professional integrity requires recognition of demonstrated expertise, even when that expertise was previously undervalued within one's own organization. The carefully constructed statement, simultaneously acknowledging my professional judgment while maintaining appropriate business distance, represented something I had never expected to receive from George Miller: recognition of my legitimate expertise independent of family connection or organizational hierarchy. I appreciate that acknowledgement, I replied simply, seeing no need for elaborate response to what had clearly required significant effort for him to communicate. George nodded once, seeming satisfied with this exchange despite its brevity. As he prepared to depart, a final thought appeared to occur to him. You're hosting a reception at the Harborview this evening, I understand. Several former Miller clients have mentioned their invitations. Yes, I confirmed, curious about his raising this clearly known information. A regular client appreciation event coinciding with our quarterly visit, though expanded given recent interest. Directly across from Miller Investments headquarters, he noted with the faintest suggestion of ironic recognition. Visible from my office windows, specifically. The observation highlighted the unintended symmetry of our current positions. George watching from Miller headquarters as clients gathered. At our reception visible across the plaza. The reversal of our positions from 3 years earlier, when I had departed Boston while he maintained institutional authority, couldn't have been staged more effectively had we deliberately orchestrated it. The Harborview's sustainability credentials made it appropriate for our event, I explained honestly. The location across from Miller Investments was coincidental rather than intentional. Of course, George acknowledged, though his expression suggested he recognized the poetic justice regardless of our intent. Appropriate venue selection based on substantive criteria rather than superficial considerations. A consistent theme. In your approach, it appears. With that observation, simultaneously acknowledging our business philosophy and subtly referencing our personal history, George extended his hand formally. Thank you both for your time and direct communication. I wish you continued success personally and professionally. Likewise, I replied, accepting the handshake with professional courtesy. The brief contact carried none of the emotional charge I might once have anticipated, simply appropriate conclusion to a business meeting that had unexpectedly included personal recognition. After George's departure, James and I remained in the conference room briefly, processing the unexpected dimensions of the interaction. That was not the meeting I anticipated, I acknowledged, still somewhat surprised by George's partial acknowledgement of his earlier dismissal of my professional judgment. People occasionally surprise us, James observed thoughtfully, especially when market reality forces recognition of previous miscalculations. True, I agreed, though I suspect Miller Investments' current challenges substantially influenced his willingness to acknowledge past errors. Recognition comes easier when alternatives have failed. Undoubtedly, James nodded. But acknowledging being wrong is difficult regardless of circumstances, especially for someone of his position and temperament. Whatever his motivation, it represented a significant shift from your previous interactions. The observation was accurate. George's comments, however carefully phrased and strategically motivated, represented genuine recognition that hadn't existed during my time with Miller Investments. While hardly emotional reconciliation, the professional acknowledgement closed a chapter that had remained partially open despite my personal progress. It changes nothing about our direction, I noted practically, but provides useful closure on certain historical questions about professional judgment and market understanding. And perhaps demonstrates growth on both sides, James suggested. His capacity to acknowledge previous errors, however limited, and your ability to receive that acknowledgement without either dismissal or excessive significance. We transitioned to preparation for our evening reception, reviewing final arrangements and confirming key attendees. The interaction with George gradually receded from immediate focus as we engaged with current responsibilities, its significance, integrated but not disproportionately weighted in our ongoing activities. The Harborview Hotel's Grand Terrace provided spectacular views of Boston Harbor on one side and the financial district on the other, including the distinctive Miller Investments, headquarters directly across the plaza. The space had been transformed with elegant sustainability-themed elements, living plant displays, organic refreshments from local suppliers, subtle lighting powered by the hotel's solar installation. Perfect atmosphere, James approved as we conducted a final walkthrough before guests arrived. Sophisticated without ostentation, clearly aligned with our values without heavy-handed messaging. Exactly the balance we wanted, I agreed, appreciating how thoroughly our team had executed the concept, demonstrating that sustainability can be seamlessly integrated with traditional quality rather than requiring compromise. Guests began arriving precisely at 6, the attendance reflecting our expanding influence in Boston's financial community. Institutional investors mingled with individual wealth management clients, environmental specialists engaged with traditional portfolio managers, creating precisely the cross-disciplinary dialogue that characterized our approach to sustainable investment. From the terrace's elevated perspective, I could indeed see George Miller's corner office directly across the plaza, its lights still illuminated despite the evening hour. The geometric coincidence struck me as fitting conclusion to the day's unexpected interaction, physical proximity highlighting our professional connection while maintaining appropriate separation between distinct approaches and philosophies. Quite a view, observed Thomas Harrington, appearing beside me with champagne flutes for us both. Both literally and metaphorically, I imagine. Both indeed, I acknowledged, accepting the offered glass. Though I find the harbor view more compelling than the office buildings, personally. Understandable. Thomas smiled with gentle perception. Looking forward tends to be more productive than looking back, especially when forward contains such promising horizons. His gesture encompassed the reception, the engaged conversations, the evident interest in our approach, the tangible manifestation of what we had built from concept to thriving reality. Pacific Northwest Capital has established remarkable presence in a relatively brief period, he continued. Today's announcement about Boston Federal Trust expanding our allocation to your sustainable portfolios represents significant institutional validation. The reference to their substantial commitment, formalized earlier that day, represented exactly the kind of partnership we had developed our firm to create. Sophisticated institutional investors recognizing the substantive value of genuine sustainability methodology rather than merely following market trends. "We appreciate your trust," I acknowledged sincerely, "especially given Boston's traditionally conservative investment culture." "Conservative doesn't necessarily mean resistant to evidence," Thomas noted pragmatically. "Your performance metrics make compelling case regardless of investment philosophy. 3 consecutive years outperforming traditional approaches during market volatility speaks loudly even to skeptical ears." Our conversation continued, touching on specific portfolio developments and potential expansion opportunities before Thomas was drawn into discussion with other guests. James joined me by the terrace railing, the harbor lights creating dramatic backdrop to our gathering. "Successful evening?" he observed, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Sophia reports 3 tentative commitments from former Westridge clients, with follow-up meetings scheduled tomorrow to discuss transition details." "Excellent progress," I agreed, though the most significant development might be George's partial acknowledgement this morning. Not for personal vindication, but as indicator that even traditional institutions are recognizing the fundamental shift rather than dismissing it as temporary trend. "Market reality eventually prevails over institutional resistance," James nodded. "Though pioneers like you experience considerable friction during the transition period." The assessment was characteristically generous in attributing our success to my initial vision rather than our shared development. Before I could redirect appropriate credit to our partnership, movement across the plaza caught my attention. George Miller exiting his building, pausing briefly to look toward our illuminated reception before continuing toward the parking garage. The moment held curious symmetry. George observing our success from outside, just as I had once observed Miller Investments operations from excluded position. Yet, unlike my experience of painful rejection, his observation seemed to carry recognition, rather than resentment, acknowledgement, rather than anger. "Full circle," I murmured, watching his retreating figure. "Not quite," James corrected gently. "Circles return to their starting points. Your journey has been more spiral than circle, returning to certain coordinates but at completely different elevation." The observation captured something essential about my experience. Not merely reversal of fortune, but fundamental transformation of perspective. I hadn't simply exchanged positions with the Millers, but transcended the dynamic entirely, building something authentic, rather than merely claiming space within established structures. "Spiral definitely feels more accurate," I agreed, turning back toward our gathering, the tangible manifestation of values, methodology, and partnership we had built together. Though less about elevation than perspective, the coordinates matter. Less than what you can see from various positions along the path. "And what do you see from this particular position?" James asked, his expression reflecting genuine interest in my perception rather than merely offering philosophical conversation. I considered the question seriously, looking beyond the immediate success of our reception to the broader significance of our current situation. "Integration," I answered finally. "Professional achievement aligned with personal fulfillment, substantive value creation balanced with meaningful relationships. Past experiences contributing context to present circumstances without determining future directions." "Remarkably healthy perspective," James observed with quiet approval, "especially given the complexity of your history with Boston." "The complexity provided valuable contrast," I pointed out. "Without experiencing superficial partnership, I might not fully appreciate authentic connection. Without witnessing value compromised for appearance, I might not recognize the importance of substantive integrity." A melodic chime announced dinner service beginning in the adjacent dining room, drawing our attention back to immediate responsibilities as hosts. As we moved to join our guests, James offered one final observation. "The greatest vindication isn't proving critics wrong. It's building something so meaningful that their opinions become irrelevant to your path forward. The insight captured perfectly what I had experienced through establishing Pacific Northwest Capital and our life together. Not triumph over those who had dismissed my value, but creation of context where external validation no longer determined internal worth. The inheritance George had redirected from me to Kate now seemed almost irrelevant, a shadow of what I had built through authentic partnership rather than compromised acceptance. As we joined our guests for dinner, the significance of the moment settled into comfortable certainty, not conclusion, but continuation, not destination, but journey guided by genuine values rather than external expectations. Whatever came next would build upon this foundation of integrity, partnership, and authentic purpose. From across the room, Eleanor Winters raised her glass in subtle acknowledgement of our successful gathering. The gesture reminded me how completely my professional world had transformed, from struggling for recognition within Miller Investments to receiving genuine respect from Boston's established financial leaders based on demonstrated expertise rather than family connection. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, integrating additional clients, expanding operational capacity, maintaining methodological integrity amid growth. But tonight offered moment to appreciate the path traveled and the partnership that had made it possible, spiral rather than circle, elevation rather than return, integration rather than separation. As I joined James in welcoming our guests to dinner, George Miller and the inheritance that had once seemed so crucial continued receding into appropriate historical context, neither forgotten nor defining, simply one chapter in a story that had found far more meaningful narrative direction than anyone had anticipated when I left Boston 3 years earlier. The morning after our successful Boston reception, I awoke to an unexpected email notification. The sender, Brian Miller, triggered a momentary pause before I opened it, curious what prompted this first direct communication in over 3 years. Jennifer, the message began with characteristic formality. I understand you met with my father yesterday regarding potential collaboration between our firms. While I respect your decision to decline the proposed arrangement, I believe there may be value in discussing alternative approaches that acknowledge both our organizations' strengths. Would you consider meeting briefly during your Boston visit? Regards, Brian Miller. I showed the message to James over breakfast in our hotel suite, his expression thoughtful as he considered its implications. Interesting timing, he observed. Coming immediately after your conversation with George rather than earlier in our visit. Suggesting Brian only learned about the meeting afterward, I agreed. Which indicates this isn't coordinated strategy, but independent outreach. How do you feel about meeting him? James asked, his question focused on my comfort rather than business considerations. I considered carefully before responding. Professionally, I'm curious what alternative approach he envisions. Personally, I'm surprisingly comfortable with the idea. He seems more like a former colleague than significant emotional connection at this point. That perspective is precisely why I think you should meet him if you choose. James nodded. Your personal history no longer carries emotional charge that would cloud professional judgment, though I'm happy to join if you prefer. I appreciate that, I replied sincerely, but I think meeting one-on-one is appropriate in this case. Our history does create context that's relevant to whatever he's proposing. I responded to Brian's email suggesting coffee at a neutral location, the waterfront cafe we had passed during yesterday's walk, rather than either our office or Miller Investments. His prompt acceptance and schedule flexibility suggested genuine interest in the conversation rather than perfunctory outreach. Later that morning, I arrived at the cafe slightly early, selecting a table overlooking the harbor. Despite the familiar surroundings of Boston, I felt none of the anxiety or emotional discomfort I might once have anticipated. Brian's role in my life had been completely recontextualized by subsequent experience. No longer defining relationship, but merely one chapter in a much larger story. I recognized him immediately as he entered, the confident stride, perfectly tailored suit, and precisely groomed appearance that had once seemed so impressive, now reading as somewhat rigid and performative. He spotted me and approached with what appeared to be genuine nervousness beneath his professional demeanor. "Jennifer," he greeted me, extending his hand formally. "Thank you for making time. You look well." "Brian," I acknowledged, accepting the handshake briefly. "Please, join me." After ordering coffee, we navigated initial pleasantries. Brief mentions of Seattle's weather compared to Boston, observations about waterfront development, polite inquiry about his father's health. The careful conversational dance felt simultaneously familiar and foreign, echoing our past relationship while highlighting how completely our lives had diverged. "Congratulations on your engagement," Brian offered, gesturing toward my emerald ring. "James seems like a good match for you, professionally and personally from what I observed at the gala last night." "Thank you," I replied, surprised by the Al's apparently sincere good wishes. "We've built something meaningful together." "That's evident," Brian acknowledged with what appeared to be genuine recognition. "Pacific Northwest Capital has established impressive market presence in remarkably short time frame. The sustainability methodology you've developed is being discussed throughout Boston financial circles." The professional acknowledgement, coming without qualification or diminishment, represented significant shift from our previous interactions where my contributions had consistently been positioned as secondary or supportive rather than driving innovation. "I appreciate that recognition," I responded simply, "though I assume you suggested this meeting for a specific business purpose rather than personal conversation." Brian nodded, accepting the transition to substantive discussion. "Yes, though. The personal context is relevant to what I'm considering." He paused, seeming to organize his thoughts before continuing. "Our sustainability division failure has created significant challenges for Miller Investments. Beyond immediate client departures, it's damaged our credibility regarding market evolution understanding." The frank acknowledgement of failure rather than corporate euphemisms surprised me, suggesting either genuine reflection or desperate circumstances. Possibly both. Dad's proposal yesterday reflected traditional Miller thinking. Acquire expertise we lack without fundamentally changing our approach, Brian continued with unexpected candor. Your rejection was completely reasonable given the philosophical misalignment you identified. Yet you've proposed alternative collaboration, I noted, curious where this unusually direct assessment was leading. Brian took a breath, his expression shifting toward what appeared to be genuine vulnerability rather than strategic positioning. I'm exploring potential separation from Miller Investments, he stated directly. Establishing independent advisory firm aligned with sustainable investment principles, but leveraging my existing client relationships and portfolio management experience. The revelation caught me completely off guard. Brian considering leaving the family business that had been his birthright and professional identity throughout his adult life. The inheritance George had protected so carefully potentially rejected by its intended recipient. That's unexpected, I acknowledged, processing the implications. What role do you envision for Pacific Northwest Capital in this scenario? Methodological partnership, Brian explained, leaning forward with evident engagement. Not white-labeling your approach, but authentic collaboration to implement genuine sustainability principles. Your established methodology combined with my client relationships and traditional portfolio expertise. The proposal differed fundamentally from George's approach, suggesting legitimate implementation of sustainability principles rather than superficial marketing overlay. Yet substantial questions remained about Brian's understanding of what such transformation would require. Sustainability investment isn't merely adding environmental filters to traditional analysis, I noted carefully. It requires fundamental reassessment of value creation, risk evaluation, and performance metrics across multiple timeframes. I understand that now, Brian nodded, surprising me again with apparent recognition. Miller's failure, despite significant resource investment, demonstrated that superficial adaptation doesn't work. Genuine implementation requires philosophical alignment and methodological transformation. His language echoed our explanation to George almost verbatim, suggesting either remarkable coincidence or detailed debriefing about our conversation. "You've given this considerable thought," I observed neutrally. "More than you might expect," Brian acknowledged with a self-deprecating smile that seemed unfamiliar on his typically confident features. "The past year has been educational. Kate's pregnancy, Miller's sustainability failure, watching Pacific Northwest Capital's success, all prompted reflection on choices and values that I'd previously accepted without examination." The personal, context-created framework for his professional reconsideration. Life transitions apparently triggering broader reassessment than I would have anticipated from the Brian I had known. "Impending parenthood changes perspective," he continued, genuine emotion briefly visible beneath his controlled expression. "Forces consideration of legacy beyond financial inheritance, what values and examples you're establishing for the next generation." The observation seemed sincere rather than calculated, suggesting authentic reconsideration rather than merely strategic repositioning amid market challenges. Still, substantial questions remained about both his understanding of sustainable investment principles and his capacity to implement genuine transformation. "Your proposal has interesting potential," I acknowledged carefully, though significant details would require exploration before determining viability. "What timeline are you considering for this potential separation?" 6 to 8 months, Brian replied without hesitation, suggesting concrete planning rather than vague consideration. "Sufficient time for appropriate client transition while enabling clear methodological implementation from inception." "And George's perspective on this potential development?" I asked, knowing the significance of Brian leaving the family firm his father had spent decades building. Brian's expression tightened slightly, revealing the expected complexity. "Not yet discussed directly, though I believe he suspects my consideration given certain preparatory adjustments I've implemented. His conversation with you yesterday may have partly been exploring potential partnership in anticipation of my potential departure." The assessment seemed plausible, George seeking alternative sustainability approach, knowing Brian might separate from Miller Investments. The dynamics reflected changing power balance as Brian established independent identity rather than merely fulfilling inherited expectations. "Your proposal merits serious consideration," I concluded after thoughtful pause. "Though James would naturally be equal participant in any partnership discussion given our firm's structure." "Of course," Brian agreed immediately. "I respected your established partnership in conceptualizing this approach. Any collaboration would acknowledge both your methodological leadership and your organizational structure." The explicit recognition of our equal partnership contrasted sharply with Brian's previous attitude toward my professional contributions, suggesting either genuine evolution in perspective or calculated adaptation to current circumstances. Determining which motivation predominated would require extended interaction rather than single conversation. "I'll discuss the concept with James and follow up within the week," I promised as our meeting concluded, though I should be clear that any potential collaboration would require genuine philosophical alignment, not merely strategic arrangement. "I understand completely," Brian assured me, his expression suggesting sincere recognition. "The failures I've witnessed have demonstrated that sustainable investment requires authentic commitment, not superficial adaptation." As we parted, outside the cafe, Brian hesitated momentarily before speaking again. "I owe you an apology," he said with uncharacteristic directness. "Not just for how our relationship ended, but for consistently undervaluing your professional insight throughout our time together." Your current success isn't surprising to anyone who actually listened when you discussed investment evolution years. Ego. The acknowledgement, coming without qualification or expectation, seemed genuinely offered rather than strategically calculated. Whether motivated by recognition of past error or positioning for future collaboration, it represented significant shift from our previous interactions. I appreciate that, I replied simply, seeing no need for elaborate response to what appeared to be sincere recognition. Kate's having a boy next month, Brian added, with seemingly non-sequitur timing. We're naming him Edward after her grandfather. The personal information, offered without obvious strategic purpose, suggested desire for normalizing our interaction beyond strictly professional parameters. The gesture, while small, indicated potential for relationship defined by mutual respect rather than lingering resentment. Congratulations, I offered genuinely. Parenthood is a remarkable journey from what I observe among friends. We parted with professional courtesy, the interaction leaving me with unexpected perspective. On Brian's evolution, whether his reconsideration of values extended to genuine understanding of sustainable investment principles remained uncertain, but his willingness to question inherited assumptions demonstrated capacity for growth I wouldn't have previously anticipated. Back at the hotel, I found James reviewing client documentation from yesterday's reception commitments. His expression registered immediate interest as I described my conversation with Brian. Fascinating development, he observed when I concluded the summary. Both personally and professionally significant if genuine. That's the essential question, I agreed. Whether this represents authentic evolution in perspective or merely strategic adaptation to challenging circumstances, likely some combination, James suggested pragmatically. Few human motivations are entirely pure or entirely calculated. The relevant question is whether sufficient authentic alignment exists to create viable partnership regardless of initial motivations. The observation reflected James's characteristic wisdom, recognizing complexity without requiring perfect purity of intention before considering potential value. His capacity for balanced assessment without cynicism or naivety represented cornerstone of both our professional success and personal relationship. We should evaluate the proposition on substantive merits, I agreed. Though only after confirming Brian's actual understanding of sustainability principles rather than merely adopting terminology. A reasonable approach, James nodded, and one that acknowledges potential value while maintaining appropriate verification. Our conversation shifted to preparations for afternoon meetings, Brian's proposal integrated into our considerations, without dominating them. The balanced perspective felt significant, his potential collaboration evaluated as business opportunity rather than emotional reckoning or personal vindication. Later that afternoon, following productive meetings with prospective clients, James and I walked along Boston Harbor discussing broader implications of our expanding East Coast presence. The spring sunshine illuminated the water with diamond brilliance, sailboats cutting clean lines against the urban backdrop. Quite different from Puget Sound, James observed as we paused to watch a vessel navigate the harbor currents, though beautiful in its own distinct way. Each has its particular character, I agreed, appreciating how the familiar landscape now carried different emotional resonance, association without attachment, recognition without regret. Brian's proposal creates interesting symmetry, James noted as we resumed walking. The inheritance George redirected from you to Kate may ultimately prove irrelevant to both families' futures if Brian establishes independent firm beyond Miller Investments. The observation captured something essential about our parallel journeys. The inheritance that once seemed central to my future, now merely historical footnote to the life I'd built, potentially becoming equally peripheral to Brian's path forward if he genuinely pursued independent direction. Life rarely follows anticipated patterns, I reflected, watching seabirds circle against the cloudless sky. 3 years ago, I couldn't have imagined standing here discussing potential collaboration with Brian while building thriving firm with you. The unexpected developments often prove most valuable, James observed, his hand finding mine with comfortable familiarity, particularly when they create space for authentic paths rather than prescribed ones. As we completed our harbor circuit, the Miller Investments building came into view, its imposing facade now carrying different significance than during my Boston years. No longer representation of aspiration or rejection, the structure simply housed one financial institution among many, its approach and philosophy neither defining standard nor personal referendum. Regardless of whether Brian's proposal develops into viable collaboration, I noted as we passed the building, this visit has provided valuable perspective on how completely my relationship to Boston has transformed. How so? James inquired, with genuine interest. The city feels familiar but not defining, I explained, considering the sensation carefully. I recognize landmarks and understand references, but my identity and future no longer connect to this landscape. It's become simply another business location rather than emotional territory. Healthy integration of experience without continuing attachment, James observed with evident approval. Neither rejection nor absorption, but appropriate contextualization. The assessment captured perfectly what I had achieved, not erasing painful history nor remaining constrained by it, but incorporating those experiences into broader narrative where they provided valuable context without determining direction. As we returned to our hotel to prepare for evening client dinner, Brian's earlier words about legacy resurfaced in my thoughts, the concept of inheritance extending beyond financial assets to values, examples, and approaches to life's fundamental questions. The inheritance George had preserved for Brian while excluding me had focused exclusively on financial and institutional control, ignoring the more significant legacy of values, vision, and authentic partnership. The irony seemed both perfect and instructive. In losing the Miller financial inheritance, I had gained opportunity to build something far more valuable, a life and organization aligned with genuine principles, a partnership based on mutual respect rather than prescribed roles, a future determined by authentic values rather than external expectations. Whether Brian would successfully navigate similar transformation remained uncertain, his capacity for genuine implementation yet unproven despite apparent reconsideration. But the possibility itself demonstrated how completely circumstances had evolved beyond anyone's planning or prediction when I had left Boston 3 years earlier. Our car arrived for transportation to the client dinner, the driver confirming our destination with professional courtesy. As we departed, I caught final glimpse of Miller Investments headquarters reflected in our hotel's mirrored exterior. Distorted slightly by the curved glass, the imposing structure appeared simultaneously, substantial and ephemeral, permanent and transitory. The image seemed fitting metaphor for inheritance itself. What appears solid and defining often proves malleable when viewed from different perspective. The legacy George had protected so carefully might ultimately prove less valuable than the freedom created by its redirection, for both Brian and myself in distinctly different ways. "Ready for final Boston engagement?" James asked as we settled into the car's comfortable interior. "Absolutely," I replied without hesitation, turning from past reflections toward present responsibilities and future possibilities. The inheritance that once seemed central to my life had revealed itself as merely temporary landmark along journey toward something far more meaningful. Authentic partnership building something aligned with genuine values rather than prescribed expectations. As our car navigated Boston's historic streets toward emerging opportunities, the city that had once represented painful rejection now served simply as another waypoint in continuing evolution. The father-in-law who had given my inheritance to his son's new wife hadn't realized the unintended gift his actions ultimately provided: freedom to build something he could never have anticipated or controlled, something whose value far exceeded what he had thought to redirect. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.